A Star in the Heavens. The Life of Father John of Valamo by Igumen Panteleirnon. Quote, "You cannot tell by observation when the kingdom of God comes. There will be no saying, quote, 'Look, here it is,' or, quote, 'There it is.' For in fact, the kingdom of God is within you." St. Luke, chapter 17, verses 20 through 21. Forward. One November day in 1984, the monastery of New Valamo received a donation of some importance. The elderly Miss Yelena Axelyevna Armfelt of Helsinki entrusted to the monastery her collection of original letters from Schema Igumen John, almost 300 of them altogether, written in Russian. Many letters from this extensive collection had previously been published in a book already reprinted several times and translated into English under the title "Christ is in Our Midst, Letters from a Russian Monk." This is a deeply spiritual work which is still able in a remarkable way to provide consolation for the suffering and searching souls of an ever-growing number of readers, and has at the same time made the name and person of Father John familiar to more and more people. Interest in the teachings of the staretz is not a feature of this age alone. As long as monasteries have been in existence, they and their inhabitants have attracted people to them like magnets. This was true in the early days of monasticism in the deserts of 4th century Egypt, and it was also true in Russia prior to the Revolution. The Russian author Dostoevsky, in his novel The Brothers Karamazov, introduced us to the figure of the gentle, loving Orthodox staretz in the person of his Father Zosima, modeled on Schema hieromonk Ambrosi of the monastery of Optina. Finnish readers were first introduced to the Valamo staretz Schema Igumen John by the writer Tito Colliander, particularly in Eteria, part of his series of autobiographical works. Colliander was one of Father John's closest disciples and visited New Valamo regularly. Being proficient in Russian, he had the opportunity to talk with Father John, while as a writer, he was able to share his monastery experience with a wide circle of readers. I began in December 1984 to work systematically through the letters of Father John that had been given to Valamo by Miss Armfelt. I read them and meditated on them in the peace of my cell, absorbed in what they had to say. The more I read, the more fascinated I became. Father John's words, which are deeply spiritual and at the same time eminently human, and full of consolation and an understanding of ordinary people, captivated my thoughts and my heart entirely. Alongside this, I also came across other interesting information about the past history of the monastery, about many events which took place there in its everyday life, and naturally also about Father John himself. Thus, as I was reading the letters, the idea came to me that one could well write more about the life of Father John. His teachings were readily available in the collection of his letters, but there were very few people left who knew anything about him as a person. The letters now donated to the monastery would serve as excellent source material. By the time I had finished reading the letters, I had felt a real inner urge to begin on a biography of Father John. Igumen Panteleirnon. In a Russian Home. I read the letters that Yelena Axelyevna Armfelt had received from Father John with immense interest. It was like rummaging around in a treasure chest, and I proceeded with enthusiasm and some suspense, not knowing what I might find next. Reading the letters aroused many thoughts in me, one of which was the realization that there were still people alive who vividly remembered him and his teaching. For one might easily be lulled into thinking upon reading the published collection that the recipients of the letters, like their writer, had already passed from our midst some time ago. But as I discovered, some of them were very much alive. Even his dearest disciple, the elderly Miss Armfelt, to whom most of his letters in that book were addressed, was still among us. Once I had realized this and had finished reading the letters, I was filled with an impatient desire to arrange a meeting as soon as possible with this person who had followed Father John's life so closely. Shortly after Christmas 1984, I traveled to Helsinki precisely for that purpose. I had been given the address, Lapinladenkatu, 21. I found the building easily, but even as I stood in the entrance hall, I could not help noticing how dilapidated it was. An old, ramshackle lift still managed to take me up safely to the 4th floor. In the dark corridor, it was only with difficulty that I was able to make out the name written in small letters on the door. E. Armfeldt. I felt slightly apprehensive as I rang the bell. 3 women, 2 elderly and 1 younger, hurried to answer. The smaller of the 2 older women, with snowy white hair, greeted me profusely, while the other, taller and dark-haired, stood behind her, looking at me with an air of friendly curiosity. The younger person was evidently Marina, the babushka's faithful friend, and the person who had made the practical arrangements concerning Father John's letters. The expressions of welcome continued, but I managed to take off my coat as we moved from the long, labyrinthine corridor into the living room. On the way, I glanced through the open door into the kitchen and saw that food had been prepared in anticipation of my visit. There were dishes and pans everywhere. The minute I entered the apartment, I was aware of having stepped out of the atmosphere of Helsinki into a Russian world, a typical Leningrad home, perhaps. This feeling grew stronger as I went into the living room, for everything was exactly as it would have been in a Russian household. The room was crowded with things: furniture, tables, chairs, armchairs, and 2 large beds. Paintings, large and small, hung on the walls, together with innumerable small framed photographs, all in a pleasing state of disorder. The old women were devoutly orthodox, so that one corner contained a great number of icons of all ages and depicting a variety of subjects. The whole apartment had been furnished in the Russian style. In other words, it was in a state of carefree but comfortable disarray. Gone was the systematic, cold atmosphere of the Western world, and in its place was the human warmth of this Eastern people. And in the middle of it stood the dining table. Chairs had been arranged around it, again in Russian style. Some fine antique ones interspersed with a few standard post-war specimens. Since I knew that the babushkas were old and frail, I had assumed that they would only serve me a glass or 2 of tea, but I saw at once that I had been mistaken. The table had been piled with food. We sang grace, and then I was immediately invited to sit down for a meal. We ate according to the Eastern custom, the meal consisting of a large number of dishes with drinks in between. This meant that it lasted many hours, the whole duration of my visit, in fact. All this time we were engaged in fascinating conversation, in Russian, naturally. The smaller, white-haired woman was Yelena Axelyevna, and the taller, dark-haired one, Paula Maximovna, who had lived with her for many years. Yelena Axelyevna had been almost blind for some time, but it was difficult to believe so from her lively, expressive face. She was 83 years old, and Paula Maximovna 4 years older. She too was weakened by old age and infirmity in many ways, but was mentally extremely alert. By living together and helping each other, they were still able to manage in their own apartment. Admittedly, an important factor in this was their, quote, personal physician, the Estonian-born Dr. Veer, a distant relative of Paula Maximovna, who rented a room from them and cared for them as he would for his own grandmothers. There were also many friends who helped them, the closest of whom was the round-cheeked, bright-eyed, ever-friendly Marina, their faithful disciple. Yelena Armfeldt and Paula Schmaltz. During the meal, Yelena Axelyevna told me the story of her life. She was born on December 15th, 1900, in the city of Kronstadt, on the Gulf of Finland, near St. Petersburg. The city was particularly famous at that time on account of the powerful preacher and miracle worker, Father John Sergeyev, who lived and worked there. He was known to many as the pastor of all Russia, and his influence was such that tens of thousands of pilgrims streamed into the cathedral of St. Andrei in Kronstadt. Yelena Axelyevna's mother had been among those who attended his services, and the famous pastor had once personally blessed little Yelena as well. The Armfeldts are a well-known Swedish-speaking family in Finland with long military traditions, the branch from which Yelena Axelyevna was descended, having served in high positions in the Russian army from the times of Catherine II. Leo Tolstoy mentions a General Armfeldt in his novel War and Peace as an officer who was in the inner circle of Alexander I at the time of the war with France, and subsequent generations also served in the Russian army. Yelena Axelyevna's grandfather was a vice admiral, and her father, Alexei Alexandrovich, was a captain first class in the Navy. Her mother, Julia Oskarovna Enquist, had also been born in Kronstadt and was the daughter of a notable family. The only one of Yelena Axelyevna's blood relatives who was actually Russian was her maternal grandmother. All the others were of Swedish descent. Yelena Axelyevna nevertheless considered herself Russian, claiming that, quote, "my Russian grandmother wiped the board with all the others." Her parents were divorced when Yelena was just 7 years old. When news of this event reached the Tsar through some relatives who were close to the court, he regarded it as quite improper and punished her father by sending him to serve in the navy on the river Amur in Siberia. As a descendant of a high-ranking military family, Yelena was able to study at the famous Smolna Institute, a boarding school which accepted only the children and grandchildren of generals and admirals. The children were allowed home only for Christmas and the month of August. The school was often visited by famous people, among them even the Tsar and the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg. Yelena Axelyevna particularly remembered Nicholas II's beautiful eyes and kindly face. The Bolsheviks closed the Smolna Institute in 1917 and sent its pupils to the city of Novocherkassk on the River Don. It was there that Yelena Armfeldt completed her last year of school. After the revolution, Yelena Axelyevna, like many other Russian immigrants, moved to Helsinki to live in conditions that were outwardly modest but at least safe. While her mother took care of their small household, Yelena went to work. She was an accounts clerk for the Orm Motor Spares wholesaler, a position which she occupied right up to her retirement. The lives of both mother and daughter were closely bound up with the small Orthodox parish of St. Nikolai in Helsinki. Both were instrumental in founding and building up this parish, which maintains Russian traditions and continues to follow the old calendar and to belong to the Patriarchate of Moscow. Divine services are still celebrated on Sundays and feast days in the rich atmosphere of the little church standing in Hyetaniemi Cemetery. Despite her frailty, Yelena Axelyevna is still able to attend the church's devout services now and then. The life story of her companion, Paula Maximovna Schmaltz, is equally colorful but more tragic. She was born in Joensuu in eastern Finland, where her father was a clerk in an English firm that imported flax from Russia. He was part French and part German, but considered himself Russian, as he had lived most of his life in that country. Her mother was Russian, from Arkhangelsk, and Orthodox. Later, the family moved to Estonia, and from there to St. Petersburg, where Paula Maximovna remembered going regularly to performances at the Mariinsky Theater. She moved back to Finland when the revolution broke out, and then to Estonia once more during the Continuation War of 1942 through 44, together with her son. She did not have an Estonian passport, however, and was sent to a concentration camp, where she remained imprisoned for 4 years. Her son died during that time, and she has still not been able to put all her sufferings in Estonia out of her mind to this day. After the war, Paula Schmaltz moved back to Finland. She met Yelena Axelyevna for the first time in church. Yelena liked to wear wide-brimmed hats, even in church, and it was this sight that caught Paula's attention, and even though she did not like these, quote, airfields, they became firm friends. When eventually Yelena's mother felt that her end was near, she asked Paula if she would move into the apartment after her death, as she did not believe that her own impractical daughter could cope with life's problems on her own. Paula did come to live with Yelena, and the new flatmates found many common interests in the church, including pilgrimages to Valamo and friendship with its staretz, Father John. Father John's childhood and youth. Little is known about the childhood of Schema Igumen John, who was to become a staretz at Valamo. All that we do know is derived from short notes in the monastery register and a few of his own recollections. The latter give the impression of a happy childhood, although he seldom looked back on those times, and then only in a few words. The register of members of the monastery of Valamo for 1914 tells of a monk by the name of Jacinth, which was the name Father John had adopted on taking his vows, born on February 26, 1873, in the government of Tver in Russia. His secular name was Ivan Alexeyev. The exact village in which he had lived is not mentioned, but it could well have been Ilyanskoye, where there was a church dedicated to the prophet Elijah. In any case, he evidently went to the church school there, and it is mentioned in the register that he was able to read and was familiar with the catechism and with church history. Father John recalled his parents, Tatiana and Alexei, as being exemplary people. They were peasants, probably freed serfs, and lived in one of a row of similar wooden cottages. The houses in Russian villages are built side by side, almost touching each other, their gable windows looking out on another row of cottages on the other side of the street. The window frames are always carved, and there is a little fenced garden beneath the gables at the end of the building, usually with a bench on which the old women in their white headscarves and the old men in their flat caps sit on warm evenings and chat about matters which may seem trivial to the world at large, but which are of the utmost importance to them. The Alexeyevs' home was one of these innumerable friendly wooden cottages spread all over the vast country of Russia. Every able-bodied person in the village worked out of doors during the day, while in the evenings the people were busy inside their cottages. During the dark period of the year the cottage would be lit by a burning splinter. Father John remembered his father plaiting shoes from birch bark, while his mother mended clothes, helped by his sister. His two brothers also joined in the work. The home being small and poor, Ivan's older brother moved to St. Petersburg once he had grown up, and opened a tavern there. It was evidently the second brother that remained to look after the home, as Ivan went into a monastery. His sister presumably married, and who knows but there may be children and grandchildren of Father John's brothers and sister still living in the present district of Kalinin, the former government of Tver. The young Ivan learned to read at home, together with his sister. Their teacher was an itinerant tailor who sewed fur coats in the cottage as well as giving them lessons. His sister was sharp-witted and quickly learned to read, but Ivan found it more difficult, although he grasped the idea in time. Even in his youth, Ivan showed a personal interest in religious matters. He remembers having bought some cheap booklets on the lives of the saints for a few kopecks each, and having studied these avidly, he also had a friend of the like mind who was interested in religious matters, and the two young boys used to go on pilgrimages together. He had evidently had some encouragement in this direction in early childhood, for he recounts that his parents, Tatiana and Alexei, went on a number of pilgrimages to places such as the monastery of St. Joseph of Volokamsk, taking Ivan along with them. This monastery, built in the old Russian style, had been founded in the late 15th century, some 18 versts away from the town of Volokamsk, in the province of Moscow. The specialty of its ascetic life was its literary work. Its founder, Joseph, had himself copied liturgical books and written works of spiritual instruction, and his followers had continued his good endeavors for the purpose of providing instruction for the brethren there and other believers. The monastery of Volokamsk was also well known as a place where notorious state prisoners were kept. The deposed Tsar Vasily Shuisky, for example, was banished there, and its history also contains the extraordinary piece of information that it was there, to this monastery renowned for its literary work, that Metropolitan Maximus the Greek and his followers were exiled, having previously themselves been commissioned to correct the errors occurring in the liturgical texts. St. Joseph had founded his monastery on a most picturesque site on the shore of an open stretch of water. The tall belfry, which resembled the famous Ivan Kaliki Tower of the Kremlin in Moscow, combined with the cupolas and crosses of the numerous churches to give the whole place a most impressive air. It was said that the Volokamsk monastery was at its most awesome in the mysterious shimmer of a moonlit night. It was to this, one of the most famous pilgrimage sites in the whole of Russia, that Tatiana, Alexei, and little Ivan, along with thousands of others, made their way on a number of occasions for church festivals. When he was 13, young Ivan began to set out with his friend on pilgrimages of their own to monasteries further away. One place that they visited was the Hermitage of Nilos, which had grown up on an island in Lake Seliger, where St. Nilus, the great ascetic of silence and prayer, had lived, 150 versts away from their own home. St. Nilus had spent all his day at work and his nights in prayer, and had overcome bodily fatigue and the need for sleep by fastening wooden bars to the wall of his hut, on which he could lean at the moments of greatest exhaustion. The great ascetic had passed away on December 7th, 1555, but soon after his death miraculous cures began to be wrought at his grave, so that in time the island became a center for pilgrimages, and a monastery was founded to bear the name of the saint and honor his memory. An annual procession used to take place to the island to mark the feast day of St. Nilus at the end of May, setting out from the nearby town of Ostaskov. The journey was made in a flotilla of small boats, decorated with flags of many colors and headed by a larger vessel. During the feast, the remains of St. Nilus, contained in an ornamental casket, were carried around the monastery in procession, after which the Holy Liturgy was celebrated. It may be that Father John and his friend were present at the monastery at the time of such a procession. At least, we know that they wanted to meet a woman by the name of Matrona, who was living as a hermit in the nearby forest, but were unable to find her. It was around this time, at the age of 13, that Ivan bade farewell to his own village, the rows of friendly cottages and all the childhood memories that were so dear to him, and moved to a completely new and different world, that of the mighty city of St. Petersburg, to work in his brother's tavern. Hardly any place on earth exposes the beauty and misery of human life so uncompromisingly as a tavern does. It is a place where people come to revel in their joys and to drown their sorrows. Its atmosphere changes scarcely at all from one century to the next, for its clientele, ordinary people, remain the same. Whoever has made the acquaintance of a tavern has seen something of the tragedy of human life. The young Ivan worked in his brother's tavern for 3 years, during which time he was faced with a genuine picture of the reality of human life from morning to night. It would be difficult to imagine a more down-to-earth, realistic training ground for a future staretz and comforter of suffering souls. During the day he stood behind the bar, witnessing the life of the drunks, and learning to tolerate them, while the rest of the time he would spend on spiritual exercises, reading and going to church. Matters of this world did not depress him, but neither did they attract him. He still felt a calling for a deeper spiritual life. When the first suitable opportunity arose, Ivan went with a friend who could speak some Finnish to look at the monasteries beside Lake Ladoga. First, they spent some time at Konovica, and then they went on to Valamo, where the 16-year-old Ivan remained to study for the life of a monk.
In Valamo and St. Petersburg. On arriving at Valamo, the young Ivan was soon sent to live and work in one of its many smaller branches or skeets, that dedicated to St. Herman of Valamo, located in the village of Siksisalmi, in the parish of Impalati, on the northern shore of Lake Ladoga. Construction work was still in progress there when he arrived, and in fact the impressive stone-built church was not completed until the beginning of the present century. In the meantime, daily services were held in a chapel set up in the main building, a largish, rambling wooden house. The skeet of St. Herman was engaged in large-scale agriculture and livestock rearing, and Ivan was assigned to helping in the cowshed and in the fields, work with which he had been familiar since his childhood. He also assisted in the cobbler's workshop and in the baking of the holy bread. All the tasks performed in a monastery, however humble or distinguished, are regarded as being equally valuable before God. They are looked on as acts of obedience to God and to the leadership of the monastery. Ivan did his work in the cobbler's workshop, together with Brother Victor, a Riasophoros, or advanced novice, who was later consecrated as a schema monk, under the new name of Vissarion, and the two shared the same cell. Many years later, Father John recalled how his friend had lived the life of a true ascetic. He would be up in the morning before the midnight service and go into his workshop to pray so as not to disturb his roommate, and he would always be in church before the others and be the last to leave. Father John acknowledged that he had benefited and learned a great deal from his time spent living with Brother Victor. After spending almost 4 years at the Skeet of St. Herman, Ivan was called up into the Russian army to perform his military service, which at that time lasted 4 years. Ivan was assigned to a rifle battalion. On his discharge, the young man returned to his home village, where he lived with his parents for a few years. He entered Valamo for good on May 28, 1901, and as he remarked in his later reminiscences, quote, "I have lived in a monastery ever since, and the idea of returning to the world has never entered my mind." Unquote. New duties were awaiting Ivan on his return to Valamo. At first, he worked in the bursar's office on the main island, but it was not long before he was assigned a new task, which was not a pleasant one, but, being an act of obedience, had to be accepted and fulfilled with as good of grace as any other. He was sent to work in the chapel belonging to Valamo at the Kalashnikov harbor in St. Petersburg. The monastery had 3 bases and centers of operation in St. Petersburg, of which the main one was a monastic hostel, or podvorye, close to the Kalashnikov harbor on the northern branch of Neva. Consisting of a church and various residential buildings, all of stone, this institution, dating from the time of Igumen Damaskin, was like a skeet set up in the capital. It was in this podvorye that Ivan was to work. In addition to the Kalashnikov podvorye, Valamo also possessed a chapel and living accommodation on the island of Vasily, where a large wooden chapel, much in the style of a church, had been built in the days of Igumen Gabriel, towards the end of the century, and dedicated to the memory of St. Sergius and St. Herman of Valamo. Daily services were held in this chapel, and spiritual literature published by the monastery was sold there. There was then another 2-story stone residence in the city which had been donated to the monastery in 1871 by its previous owner, Alexandra Obraztsova. Father John was of the opinion that the 2 years that he spent in St. Petersburg did him more harm than good. The small group of monks assigned to work in the capital were responsible not only for holding services in the podvorye, but also for managing practical affairs between the monastery and the city. This meant constant errands in the city, its shops, its stations, and its harbor, and brought Father John in contact once more with the harsh image of the big city which he had known in his youth. Many years later, when traveling by boat from New Valamo to Quapia, the then schema igumen and staretz John gazed at the hustle and bustle of the world around him and recalled, quote, "It was interesting to observe how men live. It brought to mind the words of St. John the Theologian, 'All that is of the world is lust of the flesh, deception of the eyes, and vanity of life.' This proves true at every step. Ambition and pride are to be seen everywhere, and the whole bustling world, with all in which it delights, is caught up in the maelstrom. St. Isaac the Syrian says of it, 'The world is a flatterer and a liar, and will realize its own state only when it passes into eternity.'" Unquote. Although Father John was unhappy in St. Petersburg and claimed that it had a pernicious influence on him, he was nevertheless obliged to remain there for 2 years. He went back to Valamo at least once during that time, however, for he was consecrated a monk there in June 1910, receiving the name Yakimf, the Greek form of which, Hyakinthos, means a jewel. After many requests had been turned down, Igumen Mavriki finally allowed Father Yakimf to leave the Kalashnikov Podvore and return once again to the island of Valamo, where he was assigned to the skeet of the prophet Elisha. This skeet, situated on a separate, small island, was to become Father John's home for the next 3.5 years. Divine services were held there in accordance with the monastic rule.
Vespers in the evening, and the three-part canon to the Savior, the Mother of God, and the guardian angel, followed by an akatistos to the Savior and the Mother of God on alternative days. Later came evening prayers, including recitation of the Jesus Prayer. The morning began with the midnight service, matins, and the canonical hours. The liturgy was celebrated only on Saturdays, Sundays, and feast days. Father John's part was that of a reader. There were only 8 monks in the skete at that time, and life went by in peace and mutual understanding. Each strove to grow in the spiritual life in proportion to his own abilities. Admittedly, Father John remembered the hieromonk as being a particularly stubborn character, but was of the opinion that this simply provided the others with an opportunity to exercise the virtue of patience. Father Joachim's peaceful years in that skete came to an end when he was ordered to return to the main monastery, his new duties being to help in the kiosk at the monastery hotel. Later he was assigned to the skete of St. Herman to act as a reader, and eventually came the posting that he had been hoping for years. He was sent to the skete of St. John the Baptist. Life here was more austere than the usual monastic rule, and this is what attracted the young monk. At the same time, there were several staretz living there who were well advanced in the spiritual life, and Joachim was now able to become a disciple and fellow ascetic of theirs. I have in front of me on my desk a souvenir of these years, a small icon of the Mother of God of Vladimir painted on a gold background, and with an ornamental vignette on the back, and beneath it an inscription in Russian, which may be translated as, quote, "I present this holy icon to Sister in Christ Seraphima on her name day, June 29th, 1918, Brother Joachim of the Monastery of Valamo." The icon was among the earthly possessions of Sister Sophia, who was buried in the cemetery of New Valamo some years ago. She was one of the pilgrims who remained at Valamo when the Russian border was closed after the revolution, and lived there for the rest of their lives, engaged in work and prayer. Many of them were consecrated as nuns in the monastery, as was the case with Seraphima, who took the name Sophia. In the last years of her life, when almost blind, the round-featured, clear-voiced nun recalled how she intended to return to Russia from Valamo to enter the famous convent of Diveyevo, founded by Saint Seraphim of Sarov, and had asked the then Father Joachim for his advice. He had urged her to remain at Valamo. The revolution had already begun, it was difficult to travel to Russia, and the fate of Diveyevo, and indeed the whole Russian Church, was in the hands of the Almighty alone. Thus it was that Seraphima had stayed at Valamo. This episode from 60 years back tells us something of Father John at that time, namely that he already had the ability to approach a person in spiritual difficulties and felt the desire to help that person. This was the case with the peasant woman Seraphima Zhukin, who had come from the Minsk government via St. Petersburg to Valamo, and this would be the case with a great number of others who were to arrive at the monastery in search of help in later years. The blessed life of a hermit in the shade of the spruce trees on the island of St. John the Baptist lasted for 6 years, after which Father Joachim was unexpectedly drafted to a new burdensome assignment. The highest authority in the church appointed him igumen of the monastery of St. Tryphon of Pitsamo, in the far north, on the coast of the Arctic Ocean. The Monastery of St. Tryphon. The Pitsamo Monastery, far away on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, had been founded in the early 16th century by St. Tryphon. Born in the province of Novgorod, and known by the secular name of Mitrophon, he had at an early age obeyed the call of his heart to preach the gospel in the land where it had not previously been heard, and had set out for the Kola Peninsula. The area was inhabited by Skolt Lapps, who had for a long time been living within the sphere of influence of Novgorod, and Mitforan settled down to live among them. While apparently engaged in trading, he studied their life and customs, and when he was better acquainted with them, he began discreetly to tell them about Christ and to point out the absurdity of their pagan forms of worship. 20 years went by before he had a group of Skolts ready for holy baptism, at which stage, being himself a layman, he set out for Novgorod to fetch a priest who could baptize them. There he met the archbishop and received his blessing for the plans to build a church and to obtain the services of a priest. Eventually, hieromonk Ilya came from Kola to baptize Mitrofan's followers, dedicate the already completed church to the Holy Trinity, and consecrate Mitrofan as a monk under the name of Tryphon. This took place on February 1st, 1533, which is taken as the date of the founding of the monastery of the Holy Trinity at Petsamo. Like most monasteries, that at Petsamo had experienced periods of prosperity and periods of decline. Tsar Ivan Vasilievich held St. Tryphon in particularly high esteem and made large donations to the monastery. On one occasion, when the latter was visiting Moscow on monastery business, Tsar Ivan placed a suit of his valuable robes in Tryphon's hands and instructed him to make use of it for the needs of the monastery church. Similarly, the Tsar granted the monastery extensive fishing rights to provide it with financial support. The young, rapidly developing monastery suffered a devastating setback soon after Tryphon's death, however, when Finnish troops, led by Juho Vasainen, attacked it on Christmas night, 1590, and brutally murdered the monks and workers whom they found in the church and elsewhere. Only those who were working further away escaped with their lives, and it was their sad task to bury the charred remains of the holy martyrs, which they found in the ruins of the monastery. Life at the monastery of Petsamo came to a standstill after this, and the situation remained unchanged up until the last few years of the 19th century, when a group of 11 monks arrived from Solovetsk to reconstruct that ruined monastery. New inhabitants had naturally taken up residence at the site, however, and were by no means willing to relinquish the place which had become their homes. Then, according to the chronicles, a most peculiar event took place. A bear wandered into the area. No damage had been caused by bears in that area in living memory, but now, from August 18th onward, it roamed around the village every night, killing the livestock, mostly cows and sheep, and no one was able to shoot it. The inhabitants were convinced that the bear had been sent by St. Tryphon as a reminder that they should move elsewhere, as the monks had requested, and leave the old monastery site to them. The monastery of Petsamo experienced the greatest and most brilliant period of outward development in its history at the beginning of this century, when in the space of some 20 years it was completely rebuilt and became very much more prosperous and impressive than at any time in the days of St. Tryphon. The number of monks and workers lived there reached some 200, and through their diligence the monastery emerged as a major cultural center on the Arctic Ocean coast. Electricity was installed in 1911, for instance, and the monastery also had a post and telegraph office. And most important of all, it served as a bastion for strengthening the position of the Orthodox faith in the far north. By the time that we're speaking of here, the monks also had brickworks and had accumulated over 1 million bricks in readiness for building an imposing new church. These plans were never carried out, however, for the First World War broke out a few years later, and all the workers, including the novices, were summoned away from the monastery. The Peace of Tartu left the monastery of Petsamo within Finnish territory, and the border was closed. This meant that no new monks could come there from the Kola Peninsula and Arkhangelsk, and thus the monastery was doomed at the same stagnation and decline as was to set in at Valamo and Konevitsa. It was to this monastery in the far north, with its members declining and its buildings deteriorating, that Father Yakimf was appointed igumen on 19th October 1921. Igumen at Petsamo. His appointment to the position of igumen at the monastery of Petsamo came as a great surprise to Father Yakimf. He, an ordinary monk, was suddenly made igumen without first being ordained priest. The Valamo brotherhood at that time still numbered around 500, among them 75 hieromonks and 35 deacons, and many of the hieromonks had already been awarded a gold cross as a sign of seniority. Father Yakimf regarded himself as a person of no more than average intelligence, and thus the choice astonished him, but for some reason he was too afraid to refuse. Father John's recollections of his feelings at that time are to be found in M. A. Johnson's Valamski Starci, printed in Berlin in 1938. He recounts that he took the news of his appointment perfectly calmly, a reaction which he wondered at himself, as he was a shy, timid man by nature. Sometimes, when he had visited the main monastery from his skete and had gone up to kiss the book of the Gospels during the polileo of the vigil service, his feet had begun to tremble and his head swim until he was afraid of falling, so that he occasionally had to refrain from doing this at all. But now quite the reverse happened to him following his appointment as igumen. He was moved to tears instead of shyness and fear. He had only a short time to prepare for his long, arduous journey, for everything had to be ready within 2 weeks. Then he was faced with traveling to the far north, a journey of 17 days, the last leg of which took place by reindeer sleigh. The new igumen had been urged at Valamo to prepare a solemn inaugural speech for the Petsamo brotherhood and to ask for help in doing this from those monks who had specialized in the writing of speeches. He not only declined this help, but even refused to compose any speech at all. Father John and his retinue arrived at the monastery of Petsamo one day around the New Year. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the newcomers were greeted by the ringing of bells. When they stepped into the church, all the inhabitants of the monastery were gathered there to receive them, a few dozen monks and the workers. The holy doors in front of the altar were opened, and the choir began to sing the Christmas Kontakion. Quote, "Today the Virgin gives birth to him who is above all creation." Unquote. Father John was moved, but managed to hold back the tears. They clothed him in a silk robe, and he stepped up to the altar and kissed the holy table and the sarcophagus of St. Tryphon. As he turned to the congregation, it suddenly occurred to him that he must say something, and so he began. Quote, "Good day to you, holy fathers and brothers. I have been sent to you as an act of obedience to serve as your leader, and with me 2 others to help me. I beg you to accept us in your midst. I have been made igumen directly from being a monk, and have had only 2 weeks to learn to officiate at the divine services and to prepare for this journey. I beseech you, holy fathers, to overlook any mistakes I may make in the services in a spirit of Christian charity. Moreover, I have come to you from another monastery and am unfamiliar with your customs and rule, so I call upon you to help me. The most important thing, holy fathers, is that there should be peace, love, and mutual understanding among us. If we can achieve that, then everything will go well and the Lord will have mercy upon us. Amen." Unquote. Father John simply accepted the monastery just as it was and did not even inspect anything. By his own account, the brethren looked on him kindly, and with God's help he gradually began to accustom himself to his new task with its many responsibilities. One thing that the new igumen noticed was that the monks had received only a nominal religious training. They rarely went to church and did not read the works of the Holy Fathers. Thus Father John immediately set about explaining to them the meaning of the monastic life and recommended that they should read these works. Some of them took heed of his advice and began to attend services more regularly and to go more deeply into the writings of the ascetics. Even so, the first years in particular were difficult for the new igumen. There was a great difference between Valamo and Petsamo in the quality of their ascetic life, and visions of his beloved monastery of St. Sergei and St. Herman began to come into his mind more and more often. He was becoming homesick for Valamo. Since at the same time certain unpleasant difficulties had arrived at Petsamo, he announced to the brethren one day that he wished to return to Valamo. He explained the situation himself in the following words. Quote, "The enemy of humanity moves in a very cunning way. Like a soldier who has become wise in matters of war, he knows that it is essential to confound the leader first, for then it will be easy to throw the troops into confusion. So he tainted my mind and heart with feelings of sorrow, depression, and longing for Valamo, my spiritual home. I kept thinking of the staretz there, with whom one can always share one's sorrows at moments of difficulty. It would be fitting to spend my ascetic life there, for in this sense I knew Valamo well, and so I began to consider how I could conveniently arrange to return there. Then, when certain disagreeable events occurred here as well, I decided that the time was ripe to set out." Unquote. This was not to be, however, for the brotherhood begged him to stay, and so he remained with them at the Petsamo monastery for another 8 years. Finally, at his own request, Father John was relieved of his duties of obedience as igumen of the monastery in October 1931, and by spring of the following year he had rejoined the Brotherhood of Valamo and re-established himself in his familiar skete of St. John the Baptist. In the skete of St. John the Baptist. About 4 versts away from the main monastery of Valamo is a steep-sided, rocky island where monks are thought to have dwelled from the very early times, perhaps even from that time when Valamo was founded. It is on this island that the skeet of St. John the Baptist was. After the main monastery had been destroyed by the Swedes in the early 17th century, some of the surviving monks returned to the island of Valamo once conditions had calmed down somewhat, and it is known that they settled to live a quiet life on that same island of St. John the Baptist, for some remains of their huts were still visible there in the mid-19th century. The majority of the monks who had survived the Swedish onslaught fled to the city of Staria Ladoga, on the southeastern shore of the lake, where they were permitted by the Tsar Mikhail Feodorovich to use the buildings of the Vasilyevsky Monastery. Here they built a simple wooden church dedicated to the Transfiguration of Christ more than 200 years later, when Valamo was flourishing once again. Igumen Damaskin, the builder Igumen, and this badly dilapidated but historically precious church moved to Valamo and erected on the island of St. John the Baptist. The furnishings of this little church are said to have been extremely simple but stylish. The wooden parts of the iconostasis were carved in pine. The icons themselves were painted in the ancient style, and the walls were of bare logs with no paneling or paint. A small house in the traditional style was built for the use of the skeet, and a well was dug in its yard. Finally, all three, church, house, and well, were enclosed by a fence, and a small garden with apple trees and berry bushes was started in the front of the house and church. In the course of time, various simple log huts were built in different parts of the island as dwellings for the hermits. The skeet of St. John the Baptist was intended as a place for those who wished to lead a more austere ascetic life, and for this reason the fasts were also observed more strictly there than elsewhere in the monastery. Dairy products such as milk, butter, or eggs were never used, nor was fish eaten there, and even the use of oil on the vegetable dishes was forbidden on many days in the church year. It was to this island of solitude, which he knew of old, and which he had remembered with such longing, that Father John returned soon after his arrival at Valamo. At the same time, he was consecrated into the highest order of monastic life, the great schema. He became a hermit, a monk whose principal occupation was unceasing prayer for his own soul and for all suffering souls. With his consecration, Igumen Yakimf again changed his name, reverting to that which he had received at his baptism, John, equivalent to the Russian Ivan. His rank in the monastery was denoted by the unusual combination of titles, schema Igumen, to denote a former leader of the monastery who had retired to spend his old age as a hermit. Father John recalls his life at the skeet in these words, quote, "I lived by myself in a small cottage. I prepared my food myself, growing the vegetables and fetching bread from the monastery or baking it myself every now and then. I was happy to stay awake at night. I never went to bed until after midnight, and I would get up at around 2 or 3 o'clock. I slept during the day, of course, as much as nature demanded." Unquote. Women guests were forbidden at the island of St. John the Baptist, and in fact the main visitors were men pilgrims who wanted an opportunity to speak with ascetics who were leading a deeper spiritual life. One such person, who spent several happy summer months on the island in the early 1930s, was a student at Sordavala Seminary by the name of Yrjö Omari, later to become Archbishop Paavali of Finland. 50 years later, in an article included in the book Mistoja Valamosta, the Archbishop looked back with affection on the skeet and its master, Schema Igumen John, whose, quote, accounts of the wonders of a life of prayer, especially ceaseless prayer of the heart, which were simple but clearly based on his own experience, guided the young seeker onto the path of the orthodox devotional life, and at the same time explained the essence and purpose of monasticism. His instructions, as such, perhaps did not have so much influence, and were in any case limited to a few short discussions, but what did have an immense impact was Father John himself, as a person, and also the external surroundings, even the log hut amidst the dense spruces that served as his hermitage. One small but beautiful memory from Father John's years at the skeet relates to one Easter, when he chose to spend this joyful feast all alone on the island. Quote, Father Samuel went straight back to the monastery after the service at the skeet, leaving me on the island in complete silence. I climbed into the belfry and rang the bells, and then walked around the island. It was absolutely quiet. I was entirely alone. Only the merry chirping of the birds and the thrush cleverly varying its song. Unquote. Father John's life on the island gradually grew more difficult in the course of the years as the number of hermits diminished, and by the late 1930s he had taken to moving to the main monastery for the winter. There his duties were to act as an assistant to the Father Confessor and to take his turn at celebrating the divine services. By this time, progressively larger groups of visitors from both Finland and abroad were beginning to find their way to Valamo, and among them, in the summer of 1932, were representatives of the Russian Student Christian Union in Helsinki. One of these young immigrants who came to Valamo was Yelena Axelyevna Armfelt. Birth of a friendship. The émigré population that had fled from Russia to Europe and elsewhere in the West at the time of the Revolution was largely Orthodox by religion, and thus it was not surprising to find numerous new Orthodox churches built in various parts of the Western world. Naturally, many of the new parishes that sprang up also had their own youth activities, and it was out of one such local youth organization that, functioning among the Russian émigrés in Paris, that the International Russian Student Christian Union emerged, the founder of which, Father Sergei Chetverikov, visited Finland on a number of occasions before the Winter War and spent some months at Valamo in the course of one visit. The Russian Student Christian Union had two branches in Finland, one in Helsinki and one in Viborg, the founder and leading figure in the Helsinki branch being Miss Yelena Axelyevna Armfelt. Her aim was above all that this youth club should function in the spirit of orthodoxy, which meant in practice that it should have close ties with the devotional life of the Church and the teachings of the holy ascetics. The club's activities were centered around a program of weekly lectures on the life of the Church, most of which were held in Yelena Axelyevna's small flat, but it also did social work among the children of impoverished Russian families, organizing excursions and fostered contacts with members of the international body in other countries. Although the door to Orthodox Russia itself was firmly closed as a consequence of the revolution, there were certain outposts of orthodoxy which had been left on the western side. Among those in the Baltic states was the convent of Petitsa, near Tallinn, which became an important destination for pilgrimages on the part of the Russian immigrant Orthodox population. The Russian Youth Club of Helsinki also visited Petitsa in the early years of its existence and derived great blessing and inspiration from it, but an even greater experience for them was the discovery of the monastery of Valamo. Valamo, which was already renowned throughout the world, had remained on the Finnish side of the border after Finland had gained its independence, which enabled it to continue functioning when the monasteries in Russia were closed down soon after the revolution. Its activities were greatly restricted, of course, as the community was no longer able to gain any new recruits from Russia, but on the whole it was able to pursue a stable existence according to the order which it had observed for centuries. For immigrés visiting it from the West, Valamo represented a living memory of the much-mourned homeland, while for the Orthodox population of Finland it continued to serve as a focus of the Church's spiritual life and a place of pilgrimage as it had done before. It was in the early 1930s that the Russian Youth Club, led by Yelena Armfelt, became interested in Valamo and decided to visit it one summer. The young people were there well received, as was to be expected, since they were all churchgoers and fluent Russian speakers. Thus it was natural that the Russian monks there should have liked them so much and shown them so much consideration and hospitality. Although they naturally saw all the many sights of the island and reveled in its amazing natural beauty, the club members were not merely guests at the monastery, for in between the services they also helped the monks with their work. All in all, like so many guests, they became attached to Valamo with their whole hearts. At the time of their visit there was also a young Jew from Riga by the name of Simeon Jacobson, being prepared for baptism at the monastery. He had become acquainted with Orthodoxy in his home city and now wanted to join the church while at Valamo despite his parents' opposition. He was to be baptized on the shore of Lake Ladoga by immersion according to all the traditional precepts. This also meant receiving new godparents, and Igumen Panteleirnon recommended Yelena Axelyevna as his Orthodox godmother. Before his baptism, Simeon went to confession, as is proper, his confessor being Schema Igumen John, who was in the habit of coming to the main monastery from his skete for a few days each week in the summer months for this purpose. When Simeon returned from confession, he was quite overwhelmed, and told Yelena what a wonderful staretz he had been fortunate enough to meet. Quote, "Such a gentle, understanding old man." Unquote. This incident awakened Yelena Axelyevna's interest in meeting Father John and hearing his teachings. It was not long before her wish came true, and she was sitting in Father John's cell in the monastery, drinking tea and listening to him explaining about the salvation of the soul. They talked long and earnestly. Yelena was spellbound. She had never imagined or conceived that matters as serious as death, resurrection, and the salvation of the soul could be spoken of in this way, simply and elegantly. Father John and Yelena Axelyevna became firm friends, having detected a kindred spirit in each other from their very first meeting. Later, Father John would take Yelena for long walks around the roads and paths on the island, during which he would ask about the events in her life. This he did not out of curiosity, but in order to give her an opportunity to be frank and tell him in confidence about all the experiences and memories that had accumulated in the course of her young life and were weighing on her mind. Father John would simply ask from time to time, "And what next? What happened then?" It was so easy to confide in him, Yelena Axelyevna recalls 50 years later. "I just told him everything. I wasn't afraid at all. I opened my whole soul to him." The visit of the Russian Youth Club to Valamo passed by quickly, and soon they had returned to Helsinki. Yelena Axelyevna went to say goodbye to Father John, and he asked her if she would write to him occasionally and tell him how she was getting on, and send him greetings on feast days. And so it was. Their correspondence was not particularly lively in the early years, but it became more regular in the years leading up to the Winter War, and reached its full extent and spiritual depth after the war, when the Valamo community, including Father John, had moved to their new, modest quarters in the parish of Heinävesi, the place which was to become known as New Valamo. New Valamo. Exiled from their islands in Lake Ladoga as a result of the Winter War, the Valamo brotherhood found a new site for their monastery in a quite extraordinary way, which convinced them that they had been led to this new home by divine providence. The leaders of this monastery traveled around Finland looking for farms which were for sale, and when they came to a country estate belonging to the Saastamoinen family at Papaniemi in the parish of Heinävesi, they found an icon of Saint Sergei and Saint Herman, the founders of Valamo, in one of the rooms of the main building. They interpreted this as an exhortation from heaven that this was the property they should buy. The transaction was completed right away, and Father John, together with the other monks, was well pleased with the new site. The estate of Papaniemi, the present New Valamo, is situated in a position of great natural beauty on an open, sunny slope winding around the shore of Lake Uojärvi. The luxuriant lakeside is surrounded by vast, peaceful tracts of forest, and at the same time, when the monastery moved there, it still could not be reached by roads. Contacts with the outside world was mostly dependent upon regular boat services. Thus, it was a place of peace and solitude, qualities much appreciated in a monastery. One important consideration when seeking to rehouse a religious community of about 150 members was that there should be enough buildings already available to provide living quarters for them all. Although this was the case, conditions were still extremely cramped. At Old Valamo, each monk had a cell of his own, but here there could be up to 5 people occupying the same room. A long wooden building in the yard of the manor house was converted into a church during the autumn of their first year there, and in accordance with the old tradition, this also served as a refectory. The walls were hung with large icons painted on a gold background, which had been brought from Old Valamo, and these, together with other valuable church items, created an atmosphere of sanctity in the bare room. This humble church building, as well as being the place in which services were held, was also the only room in the monastery large enough to accommodate meetings and other formal gatherings.
The tall manor house itself, which occupied the side of the courtyard towards the lake, housed the igumen, members of the council of the monastery, and some of the monks, and its unheated attic was fitted out as a temporary chapel with storerooms for vestments and icons. There were two long, two-story, barrack-like buildings located end to end, which also provided accommodation for the monks, and a further long, narrow timber building in the center of the yard, known as the dairy, in which butter was churned, and which was also used to house the other people who had come from Old Valamo with the monks, and the elderly women who had remained at the monastery when the border was closed. It apparently did not worry them that the mortuary was in the same building. A big, solidly constructed stone building served as the cowshed, since the monastery continued to engage in agriculture at Papaniemi, and livestock inevitably formed one part of this. The yard also contained various sheds and storehouses. There was a spacious sauna building on the shore, right at the water's edge, and if the stove was lit from the previous day, the sauna could be ready for use from first thing in the morning. Although the new Valamo site seemed to be excellently suited for the continuation of monastic life under altered circumstances, one could scarcely speak of a renaissance taking place at Papaniemi. The brethren were already advanced in years when they arrived there, and they declined in strength and diminished in numbers more acutely than ever as time went on. Once the war was over, the monks began to consider the chances of returning to Old Valamo and resuming their former monastic life there, and in the early years the Russian Church allowed them to entertain some hopes of this. Father John took a harsh, realistic view of this, however. He was aware that, quote, "Our whole brotherhood reminds one more of the inhabitants of an old people's home at the present moment. There are 127 of us in all, of whom 71 are aged between 70 and 84, 49 are 60 to 70 years old, and there are only 7 who are under 60. A few monks insist on returning, but most of us are against it." Unquote. The whole plan gradually fell through, in any case, once the Russian Church refused to allow them to move back, although the question was to arise once again in the 1950s, but in a slightly different guise. The staretz's cell. The monastery's father confessor, Schema Igumen John, lived in a corner room on the first floor of the dormitory building nearest to the forest. It was not possible to arrange any specially secluded living quarters for the hermits in New Valamo, as had been the custom before, and so the Schema monks had to live in the same cramped barracks as the others. This two-story wooden dormitory building is still standing, although it is no longer used for the same purpose. It has a corridor running through it, with doors leading off into small rooms, which in those days served as the monks' cells. It was so crowded at that time, however, that many things had to be kept in the corridor. There was a rack outside each room for the occupants' outdoor clothing, and also cardboard boxes and other articles stored away under the long coats that hung there. Father John's cell had a bench in the corridor outside it, put there for a special purpose. Since many of the monks as well as pilgrims went to him for confession, there were often several people waiting at a time, and the bench was there for them to sit on. The staretz's cell was a simple room, a few square meters in size, with a small window looking out over the peaceful shore and lake. In one corner, above his personal altar, he had a number of icons of various subjects, the main one of which, the Mother of God of Valamo, Father Pamva presented to Yeleni Axelyevna after the staretz's death. A lamp was kept burning constantly in front of the icons. To one side of this altar corner was a special tall book rack covered with a long, embroidered linen cloth, on which he kept the large, leather-bound psalter. This volume contained not only the book of the Psalms, which monks are obliged to read as part of their own private prayers, but also the basic texts for the daily services. To the left of the door stood a high bookcase of a simple design, which was filled with old volumes, the nature of which revealed much about the intellectual and spiritual practices of the cell's occupant. They consisted entirely of the teachings of the first-century ascetics, the reading of which was Father John's favorite pastime, as well as being the source of the teaching which he passed on to others. Prominent among these books were the several volumes of the Philokalia, the basic collection of the teachings of the early fathers,
and it was chiefly from these that the staretz derived the spiritual advice that he gave, setting out from the sayings of the fathers based on everyday life and above all from the Holy Bible. The cell also contained the practical objects needed for ordinary living. There was a high-backed wooden settee, painted white, which served as the staretz's bed, and behind it a colorful wall hanging, placed there to keep out draughts and to please the eye. In front of the window was a table with a few stools, and on the floor on the right-hand side of the room a kitchen cupboard in which he kept his dishes and food, together with a basin for washing up in. There was a samovar standing on top of the cupboard, with a towel hanging above it. Yelena Alexeyevna had once asked Father John what the towel was for. Quote, "That's for wiping away the sweat when you are drinking steaming hot tea," he said. There was also a clothes rack in the room on which he hung the long black habit which he wore to services, and in winter there would be a pair of enormous felt boots standing at the end of his bed. There were needed just as much in the draughty rooms as out of doors, and their size was a telling reminder that the old man suffered badly from swollen feet. Finally, there was an old cartoon pinned to the inside of the door, showing two monks talking together, one with a small twig in his eye, and the other with an immense log. This was a concrete illustration for everyone to see of our Savior's essential teaching. Matthew 7, verse 3. Memories of the Igumens. Father John wrote to Yelena Alexeyevna on 27th October 1947. Quote, "Today at 6 o'clock in the evening, our father, Schema Igumen Panteleirnon, died peacefully. The Panikhida was celebrated at 7 o'clock. They will probably telephone the news to Helsinki in the morning. I don't know when the funeral will be, but I suppose a lot of people will come." Unquote. 27x 1947. Igumen Panteleirnon was the last leader of the monastery at Old Valamo, and had had the arduous responsibility of supervising over the evacuation. Schema Igumen John, on the other hand, pursued the outwardly peaceful life of a former igumen amongst the monks of Valamo. He was happy to keep his distance from the others in order to preserve the tranquility of his own mind and heart. His quiet years of retirement very nearly came to an end at this point, however, for the election for a successor to Igumen Panteleirnon ended in his nomination for the position. As his friends hastened to congratulate him, his answer to them revealed his feelings at that moment. Quote, "My heartfelt thanks for your letter in which you congratulate me on taking up the cross of leader at the monastery. The duty of leader at this present time is indeed a cross and a heavy responsibility, and I neither wished nor aspired to receive it. Nevertheless, I believe that it was put upon me by God, and that in His mercy He will help me to bear it successfully. I also ask you to support me with your intercessions." Unquote. 2 II 1948. The result of the election among the brethren still required confirmation from the church council in Kipio, and for some reason this was delayed. Quote, "No decree whatsoever had been heard yet from the church council, and the brethren are beginning to be anxious. But I, by God's grace, remain quite calm. I will write later and tell you how all this turns out." Unquote. 12 III 1948. In the end, the church council in Kipio rejected the monastery's choice of a new leader, appealing to a regulation that a monk who has been consecrated to the great schema cannot be appointed igumen of a monastery. New elections were ordered, and Father John commented on the result in the following terms. Quote, "The election for igumen was today. Father Yeronim was chosen. I am happy in my soul that God has released me from the yoke of leadership." Unquote. 14 IV 1948. He was indeed sincerely happy about the new turn of events. Quote, "The sorrows which I had anticipated did not, by the mercy of God, even touch me. My mood has not changed a bit. Oh, how good it is to be able to stay aloof and to put one's trust in the will of God in all things." Unquote. Paula Maximovna told a little story about Igumen Yeronim. He had been in the habit of bringing her prosphora, or pieces of altar bread, after the liturgy, a touching custom which he shared with some other startzi. Like Paula, he had the renowned hermit and ascetic Father Mikhail as his confessor, and when relations between Father Yeronim and Father Mikhail became strained for some reason, he ceased to bring Paula as Father Mikhail's spiritual child, her accustomed prosphora. This prompted Father John to do so instead, consoling her with the words, quote, "Don't worry, if this isn't given you by the Igumen of Valamo, it does come from an igumen of sorts all the same." Unquote. Paula's voice was still wistfully happy as she recounted this, as proof of the power of consolation that lay in Father John's words. Igumen Yeronim was similarly somewhat reluctant to accept the high office, feeling that he was too old and weak to take care of the monastery's affairs. He used to tell people that he was not, quote, a real igumen. Similarly, he refused to move from his simple cell into the igumen's residence on the first floor of the main building, but continued to lead his own simple life of a staretz in spite of his new position. He was also afflicted with various illnesses in addition to the many troubles that arose in the life of the monastery, and all these things bore him to the grave after only a few years in office. When he wrote to tell Yelena Armfelt about the death of Igumen Yeronim, Father John also mentioned some peculiar confusion that had occurred in the monastery while he was still alive. Quote, "Not everybody knows that the Father Igumen had a lot to say against the brotherhood. He and Father Uvian had even written a letter to Moscow." Unquote. Author's note, the monastery had joined the Patriarchate of Moscow by that time. And in the same letter, quote, "It happened when the devotions of Mary of Egypt were in progress in the 5th week of Great Lent. There were some priests from Leningrad who read the canon of St. Andrew of Crete, and then one of them made a speech at the end of Matins, half of which was to the effect that we did not show humility amongst ourselves, nor obedience to the igumen, nor discipline. There were even some who did not want to join the Russian church, and lots more besides. Not all the monks were listening to him, for many had already left, not knowing that there was to be a speech afterwards, and the few of us who were present just sighed. We live quiet, peaceful lives here, and then all of a sudden someone comes from outside and begins to reproach us. I went to say goodbye to the guests. I really wanted to discuss the speech with them, but the igumen was present, and so it was not politic to do so. I looked them straight in the eyes, and they waited, expecting me to say something. I wish you every success, I said. I couldn't find anything more to say. Then we parted. After the priests had left, the Father Igumen was taken seriously ill and was put to bed, never to get up again. I gave him the sacrament of the anointing of the sick and the Holy Communion. I wanted to give him Holy Communion again in the morning, being St. Thomas Sunday, but he was unconscious. So I hadn't given him communion today, though I had yesterday. After I had drunk my tea, I sat down to write this. Suddenly, Father Leonid came in and said, "The brothers are running you down for everything and saying what a negligent Father Confessor you are. Father Mikhail takes great care to look after the sick." And he went on in the same tone. So I went to see the igumen. He regained consciousness a little, so that those standing over him were able to give him some medicine. It was only with great difficulty that he managed to take the smallest possible particle of the Holy Communion. It is now 10 o'clock at night. I will go and see the igumen in the morning. There are a couple people sitting with him. I wish you God's blessing. May the Lord protect you, the deeply sinful schema Igumen John. P.S. The Father Igumen died at 1 o'clock in the morning. The funeral will be on Thursday, May 1st. Unquote. 27. IV. 1952. Father John wrote later in a letter to Paula Maximovna, quote, "The Sorokhost." Author's note, it is customary in the Orthodox Church to remember the dead for 40 days, hence the term Sorokhost, from the Russian Sorok, 40. To return to the text. For Igumen Yeronim will soon end on 6th June. Then one of us will become the new igumen. I beg you, pray to the Lord that he will deliver me from this yoke. Unquote. 30 v. 1952. It was hieromonk Nestor who was chosen as the new head of the monastery. He had previously served as treasurer and had been involved in church music throughout his monastic life, as either choirmaster or singer. Since New Valamo was affiliated to the Russian church at that time, the new igumen had to go to Leningrad for his consecration. He was accompanied on his journey to the Soviet Union by Father Symphorian. Quote, "Father Nestor and Father Symphorian have got their passports for traveling abroad. Now they are waiting for visas. When they receive them, they will set out for Russia. The igumen has already tried on his meter. It suits him well. He will be a worthy Igumen. May God help him to work for the good of the monastery and the salvation of his own soul. He is setting about things energetically, and there is hope that he will be a good superior." Unquote. 4. IX, 1952. By the following summer, however, Igumen Nestor was already confined to bed for several weeks, with arthritis in his legs, which caused him constant suffering. Quote, "The Igumen is being treated with electricity. He has to lie in bed for a month and must not go anywhere. You write, isn't it sad that he has been taken ill? I hope you are not just thinking that if he dies we will have to find another Igumen." Unquote. 12. V. 1953. Igumen Nestor lived on for another 14 years after this, never complaining of his discomfort, and continued as leader of the ever-diminishing brotherhood. Everyday life. Father John had been 67 years old when he arrived at New Valamo. He was still physically strong and even spent his spare time in hard outdoor labor, working in the fields in summer and chopping logs in winter. As the years went by, his strength declined, however, and he had to reduce the amount of work that he did. Even so, like the other older men, he continued to do light work out of doors for a short time each day during the winter right up to his last years. Large tree trunks were hauled into the monastery yard every autumn, and the old men used to saw these up for firewood according each to his strength, quote, "for recreation of mind and body." There are excerpts in Father John's letters to Jelena Armfeldt that tell of his feelings while sawing up the logs and many other things that went on in his busy community. Quote, "By the grace of God I am keeping well. I had pains in my heart only on one day during the first week of Lent. By the second week I was perfectly well again, and now I am going to saw wood with Father Victor. One monk commented to me today, 'They say that you don't saw very much, only enough to while away the time.' How offensive! On the other hand, we should really be offended in our minds by those who praise us." Unquote. 31. III, 1949. In the summer he wrote, quote, "By the grace of God I was able to do some haymaking. On Monday we'll start cutting the rye." Unquote. And by autumn, quote, "Praise to God that the summer's work has been done, and was successful. The weather was on our side. Now the brothers are going into the forest to chop logs. I'm resting for a while, then I'll go with them for a couple of hours after the meal. That will be enough, as I still have my duties as Father Confessor." Unquote. When he wasn't outside working or taking a walk, the staretz spent the time between the services in his own cell. In winter in particular he was very pleased to be there, as it gave him peace for prayer, reading, and attending to his own little chores. Quote, "It's very cold, but I am warm enough in my cell. I rejoice and give God thanks that I can read. Although my memory is worse than it was, I seem to be able to understand things more clearly." Unquote. 14. XII, 1954. Father John's main task in the free time left to him after discharging his daily responsibilities in the monastery was attending to his correspondence with his spiritual children, which he continued to do as long as he had even a little strength left. He also regularly sent them and other close friends greetings at Christmas and Easter. Yelena Axelyevna naturally always received a card. Quote, "I sent 16 cards for Easter according to the new calendar. I drew them myself. Here is one for you." Unquote. Ina Colliander also remembers receiving a hand-drawn Easter card from Father John, but unfortunately both cards have disappeared in the course of time. At one time, Father John had a cuckoo clock in his cell for a few months. Jelena Armfeldt recalls how he could be just like a child in some ways. When something attracted him, he simply had to have it. He had seen a clock like that in Helsinki and insisted on having one for himself. The happy owner of the clock wrote to tell her about it. Quote, "The cuckoo clock is now in my cell and has been cuckooing since the 2nd July. They sent it to me from Joensuu. It cost 4,400 marks. Now it has just cuckooed 9 times, and I am reading chapter 46 of St. Isaac the Syrian. Oh, how wonderfully the Holy Father writes, and with what a sense of justice." Unquote. 7. VII, 1952. But later his enthusiasm waned. Quote, "Father Leonid Gerasimov is visiting the monastery. He will leave on Monday and will be home in Helsinki on Tuesday. I am sending the cuckoo clock along with him as a gift to you. I am tired of it. I sit in my cell the whole time, and it cries out every hour and a half hour. You are not at home so much, and the clock will be just enough to remind you of everything. Ask Father Boris Pavinsky to come and put it up for you." Unquote. 4 IX 1952. Miss Armfeldt still has the cuckoo clock on her wall, and it still goes splendidly. Dr. Veer winds it regularly, and it continues to call out a greeting full of memories of Father John for the babushkas. Almost every letter that went between Yelena Axelyevna and Father John had something in it about food. To an outsider or anyone unfamiliar with circumstances at that time, this might seem strange, and so perhaps some explanation is called for. The monks at New Valamo were living under extremely simple, one might almost say inhumane conditions. They were a community of old men and did not have the strength or in many cases the desire to repair and modernize things connected with the externals of their way of life. This state of outward wretchedness reached its peak in the infirmary. The old monks who were bedridden lived out the last years, months, and days of their life surrounded by such stench and filth that it is better not to go into it in detail. The kitchen had also degenerated into the same state of neglect. The food itself was simple, and the often poor standards of its preparation, and especially the general untidiness of the place, did much to take away any appetite one might have. Not only were there cockroaches swarming over the dinner table, but they could easily turn up in one's soup or porridge. It is understandable, then, that many of the older monks who received old age pensions with which they could buy food supplies preferred to eat in their own rooms. Father John sometimes cooked food for himself in his cell in order to keep up his strength, although he tried at the same time to go to the refectory regularly as dictated by the monastic rules. He admitted that eating in his cell was a sin, but justified it on the grounds that it sustained him when his strength was failing, and in no way tried to excuse his behavior. There was a severe shortage of food over the whole country in the post-war years, and there was in any case no shop anywhere near the monastery, so that Yelena Axelyevna and other friends used to send Father John food parcels, often asking him to share the contents with certain other monks. Quote, "I forgot to say that I received the herrings that you sent. I divided them up and gave 5 to Father Benjamin, 5 to Father Anthony, and also some to others who needed them, as I already had plenty of herrings. Please don't send me any more." Unquote. 27 X 1947. Sometimes Father John would send food parcels to Yelena Axelyevna from the monastery. The Armfeldts lived a modest life, and so these parcels were a welcome addition to their limited rations. Quote, "I am sending you a parcel. Please don't refuse it. I don't need the raisins at all, nor the coffee, and I still have 4 rations of sugar left for myself. There will soon be a new ration coming anyway. Your mother likes sweet things. Let her enjoy it. I'm also sending some tea I dried myself from raspberry leaves." Unquote. 23 X II 1947. I haven't been able to pick up a pen to write to anybody in the last few weeks, and I was even feeling tired in the services. But then I went out to pick mushrooms and found some boletus, which I dried. They are really delicious cooked with macaroni. I haven't yet thanked you for the parcels. Please give my thanks to Nadia Schultz, too, for her package and letter, and ask her to forgive me for my rude silence. Please phone the Collianders as well and thank them for their parcel and letter. How is Olga's son Vladimir's health? I haven't been able to write to her either, and I feel very guilty. I made a 5-liter jar of black currant jam, and I've also got the dried mushrooms. I have about 3,000 marks in money and some small change, so please don't send us money. If I need any, I'll ask for it. Unquote. 19 VIII 1952. Quote, "Thanks for the buckwheat. I cook it first in a saucepan on the hot plate and then cover the pan with my fur coat for 3 hours. It comes out really well." Unquote. Quote, "I prefer savory foods nowadays. I can't eat sweet things at all. Claudia Coralin sent me some cranberries, and I made a fruit soup out of them, which I eat with tea. Do ask her to send me more. Don't you have any lemons there at the moment?" Unquote. 1 VI 1954. Quote, "When you next send a parcel, put in a couple of tins of tomato puree. Pay for them out of my money. Don't hesitate. Money is of no importance to me. I have some tea and some herrings, and I have bought 3 kilos of butter. See how a schema monk lives? Not really a schema monk, more a slave to his stomach. Sometimes I feel a great urge to live more simply, to manage only on what our modest refractory serves. But then I think that if only I can keep up my health, I can be of some help to the brethren. This is how I deceive myself, degenerate schema-monk that I am." Unquote. 26 VI 1948. According to the Orthodox way of life, believers do not celebrate birthdays, but name days, when they commemorate their patron saint. These days provide little festive moments in the midst of the everyday life of a monastery. Quote, "I received your letter and the headache powder and lemons. My sincerest thanks for all these things. I baked buns for my name day and served them with tea to the Petsamo fathers." Author's note: the last monks from Petsamo had been moved to New Valamo at the time of the Continuation War. To return to the text. "I officiated at the services on my name day, of course, and I prayed for you and your mother." Unquote. 10 VII 1947. Anything can happen in life. Each resident in a monastery shares his joys and sorrows with all the others. In this sense, nothing can be hidden. The whole wretchedness of man is manifested just as it really is. People living in a small community can easily tire of each other, and is only natural and part of the law of life. Father John would dismiss these things simply by saying that, quote, "generally speaking, anything can happen in life." Unquote. Quote, "Father Victor came to my cell after the service in a rage. How can everyone be so preoccupied when they stand there in church that no one noticed that I had to stop in the middle of the litany of supplication? But no one came to my rescue. I suppose it was because they wanted to make me angry. How malicious they are." And so he went on. I kept silent. Well, what could I say to him? I knew he wouldn't listen to me anyway. The canon for the 5th week of Great Lent and the akathist for the Mother of God the following week are services that we hold in the evening. When the Father Igumen read the canon, he began on a high pitch, and it eventually turned into a screech. One monk came up to me and said, "He should be shouting for boats in a harbor, not reading canons." Anything can happen in life. Sometimes it is difficult and hard to bear when there is no one to speak with about the one thing that matters. Unquote. One example of the tragic side of life was the case of the seamstress Maria, one of the Russian women pilgrims inherited from Old Valamo. Quote, "I imagine you know that the seamstress Maria is now just doing odd jobs. Her sewing machine was taken away, and she was sent to do laundry. But she can't work there because her right hand is so painful. Nobody trusts her. During the winter, she picks over the potatoes. The monks shout at her and find fault with her all the time, and some spit on her and don't want to set eyes on her at all. Quote, 'Such a disgusting face,' they say. 'I can't stand the sight of it.'" Unquote. Father Timon drove her away, and now she comes to me for confession. I asked one monk, "Why do you yell at Maria in front of everybody?" And now he slanders me in front of the rest. Father Timon drove her out, but Father John protects her, he says. Poor Maria doesn't even have anywhere where she can bake. She has to go to the village to do it. Unquote. 27 V 1952. The monks longed to return to Old Valamo, their previous monastic home, and the place where they had spent the best years of their life. Brother Xenophont developed such a longing that he sent off for Old Valamo on his own. Father John described this adventure. Quote, "Father Xenophont has come back. He managed to cross the border successfully on his way there and reached Sortavala on foot. He was given a lift in a workman's van for 30 kilometers. At Sortavala, he went to the quay and asked when the next boat was leaving for Valamo. It only runs on Sundays, they said. Then they realized that he didn't have a visa, and he was arrested and put in prison. He was there for more than a month for questioning. Then they sent him to Petrozavodsk, where he was again imprisoned and questioned. Finally, he was taken to the border under military escort and handed over to the Finnish police, who sent him back to the monastery. The Father Broussard was at the station to meet him and brought him here. They had tried all they could to convince him and had asked him 15 times, "You don't want to go back to Valamo anymore, do you? There's a church open in Sortavala, where they still hold services and a respected priest." Unquote. If he had gone to the priest first, things would certainly have turned out differently. He arrived back on the 18th by the new calendar. Unquote. 2 XII 1947. Old age brought its own troubles to each of the monks, and in some cases, quite understandably, it meant loss of memory. Quote, Brother Gervasi has begun to forget things. He can't even tell what time it is. And hero monk Platon doesn't understand anything anymore. He picked up the broom instead of the teapot and poured hot water from the jug over it, thinking it was going into the pot. Father Jakob has been sent to the old people's home, where I went for a rest once. He had become quite confused in the head. It's a wonder he didn't start a fire in the dormitory. They even had to bind him up with ropes to take him there. Unquote. His letters were full of small pieces of personal news and sometimes news from further afield. Quote, My walking stick has been stolen and I'm looking out for a new one. There is talk going around that the Igumen of Konovica is going to England. The strike has not affected us. Thank God things in Finland have calmed down. Claudia told me an interesting thing. The Americans built a Sputnik and invited foreigners to watch it being launched into the sky. They came and the launching was started, but the Sputnik caught fire in front of their eyes. The Americans claimed that it was sabotaged by Russian spies. It must have been hard for the people watching to keep a straight face. Unquote. 17 VI 1957. One letter ended with a happier piece of news. Quote, Ina, author's note, Father John called Ina Colliander by this name, and often referred to Tito Colliander as Titushka. To return to the text, sent me a parcel. She can be very funny. It was a little box with sweets in it, and when you open the box, it begins to play music. I offered the sweets to some of the monks, and they were fascinated with the box, too. Unquote. The life of the staretz. Schema Igumen John was both an official father-confessor for the monastery and at the same time a staretz, as monastic elders are known in the Russian tradition. It is important to make a clear distinction between these two. Only a person who has been ordained priest according to the canons of the Church can serve as a father-confessor and administer and proclaim the sacrament of the remission of sins. In fact, this is a duty required of all Orthodox priests, for listening to people's confessions, consoling the penitent, and pronouncing the forgiveness of sins is a major part of a priest's pastoral work. The work of a staretz, on the other hand, is not of a sacramental nature, and any believer, man or woman, monk or layman, can act as a staretz for others, provided he or she has the spiritual gifts required for the task. One studies for the priesthood, but one is born to be a staretz. It is a gift bestowed upon very few. In Father John's words, quote, A staretz must be free of all passions and have the gift of spiritual discretion, which means that he is able to take the following aspects into consideration. Correct timing, how to begin, how to proceed, the makeup of the person, the limits of his tolerance, the extent of his knowledge, his zeal, his maturity, his strengths, his weaknesses, his free will, his penitence, his habits, his ignorance, his ardor, the place, his education, the efforts which he makes, prayer, his slowness, God's purposes, the correct interpretation of each statement in Holy Scripture, and much more besides. This is what a staretz must have, and this is the kind of judgment he must have. Unquote. Father John set out this long list of qualities essential in a staretz in order to prove that he, so he claimed, was not sufficiently well endowed for the office. He nevertheless adds that in spite of all his faults, he will do his best to fulfill the task, trusting in God's mercy. Father John was successful as a staretz because his heart was filled with understanding and love for his fellow men, and sympathy for those who were suffering. These are innate qualities, for a man's heart cannot be altered by education or learning. A future staretz naturally has to acquire the knowledge and experience he needs in the course of his life, but the chief quality, suitability for the task, must be a fundamental part of his character. Father John was a person who had the ability to listen to and console the monks and lay people who turned to him in their anguish. Thus, the task of a staretz is to receive people who consult him in spiritual matters, to listen to them in confidence, and to try to give them appropriate instructions which they can put into practice. He listens, guides, consoles, and encourages. The tradition of a staretz is one of the richest of the Orthodox Church and an indication of its spiritual force. Traditionally, staretzi live in monasteries, where they often serve as father confessors. Many monasteries have become renowned for their staretzi. The most famous of all such holy places in Russia in the last century was the Hermitage of Optina in the government of Tambov. To the extent that it and its staretz exercised a major influence over the religious life of the whole country and equipped the Russian Church to withstand the great sufferings inflicted on it by the Revolution. Father John discharged his duties as staretz both by receiving people personally and by answering their letters. Pilgrims arriving at the monastery would go to speak with him in his cell, and sometimes he would take them for walks in the beauty of the surrounding countryside, which provided a good opportunity for discussions. Some of the monks also came to him for confession or other forms of spiritual guidance. Quote, "A monk came to me in sorrow and complained, 'My life is at an end. I have no good works to my name, and now I am overcome with misery. How can I face eternal life?' We discussed the matter together, and he found new enthusiasm and hope." One monk who has been practicing prayer for 25 years and yet has never spoken to me about it came to me recently and said, "My praying has gone astray." I was able to point out where he had gone wrong, and he thanked me. It wasn't Yevlogi, but another monk. Unquote. 17 Ix 1953. There was another father confessor and staretz at New Valamo at the time as well. His name was Schema hero monk Mikhail, known as Father Timon, before his consecration to the schema. He was the complete opposite of Father John. Where Father John tried to attend all the services and communal meals regularly and work with the others as much as his strength allowed him, Father Timon spent his days in prayer and meditation in the solitude of his cell. He was a hermit and a mystic. While Father John loved simplicity and sobriety in his life and teaching, Father Mikhail limited his teaching and other activities to the silence of his own cell. There was something special, something mysterious and solitary about him. Even at Old Valamo, he had been in the habit of celebrating the divine services alone in his cell, and he continued to do this at New Valamo, even though the monastery looked down on the practice. Father Mikhail was seldom seen out of doors, and he received those who sought to talk with him in his cell, which also served as his church. There were sufficient disciples and supplicants for both the staretz, and curiously enough, we do not find any criticism of his colleagues' activities in Father John's letters, even though ideas of the kind must have sprung to his mind from time to time merely as a matter of human nature. Father John tried earnestly to apply himself to the other person's problem, to appreciate his pains and anxieties. Often he seemed to identify himself entirely with the sufferings of his spiritual child. Quote, "Everything you write about your own inner state is just as true of me. It was as if you had been sitting beside me and writing down all of my spiritual faults. Yet we must not give in to depression, but rather begin again, with God's help, and try to live Christian lives in the true sense of the word." Unquote. 15 VIII 1954. On enduring suffering, Father John gave the following advice. Quote, "You write that your soul feels heavy, yet you must realize that you are not the only one who suffers from this. All mankind struggles beneath the yoke of Adam's disobedience. There is only one way of escaping from states like this: patience and prayer, and a belief that a change for the better is on its way, and just as there are changes in the weather, so there are changes in our lives too." Unquote. 17 III 1950. Occasionally the people wrote the staretz long letters asking him to answer a host of detailed questions. This was naturally too much for him. On one occasion he explained to Yelena Axelyevna the purpose of his short letters. Quote, "When I write letters, I don't try to answer individual questions directly, but to find a response to the person's whole inner state and life. In this way, the individual questions will be answered by themselves, and the questioner will in any case have forgotten what they were." Unquote. Sometimes the reply to a letter could be very short indeed, but practical and a complete explanation in itself. In one letter to Yelena Axelyevna, he asked her to tell Paula Karlovna that it was difficult to write letters just then. Quote, "Tell her not to worry about this, but to recite the Jesus prayer and cry to the Mother of God for help." Unquote. Sometimes a whole number of Father John's letters would leave New Valamo at the same time. Quote, "Occasionally there are a lot of people I write to. I sent 12 letters during the first week of Lent. Today I have a good opportunity, as they are going to the post office at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. So I am writing to you now after evening prayers." Unquote. 31 III 1949. Answering letters was not always that easy. Sometimes the staretz was quite exhausted by his extensive correspondence. Quote, I am quite weighed down with letters. There are still 2 or 3 on my desk, which I don't seem to be able to answer at all. Yet it is essential to answer them because they contain some serious questions. Unquote. The practical advice given by him during conversations often remained in the minds of his spiritual children for the rest of their lives. Paula Maximovna tells how he had observed her behavior when praying in church and pointed out that she should make the sign of the cross at the beginning of the singing of the creed, but not in the middle of it. Quote, even now, whether the creed is said or sung in church, I always cross myself as it begins and remember what Father John taught me. Unquote. Although Father John had lived in the monastery almost all his life, he had a deep understanding and sympathy for the lives and problems of priests serving and working in parishes. Yelena Axelyevna had sent Father John a newspaper cutting about pastoral work, and he wrote back with an appraisal of it. Quote, I read the article about pastoral care. The writer is simply not of this world. He is writing in an ivory tower. He has not seen the family life which priests lead, and is writing merely on the evidence of his intellect, without any practical experience. He claims to describe what a priest should be like, but anyone possessed by that kind of intensity of spirituality must be a saint. But where can we find priests like St. John of Kronstadt, for instance? They do not exist. So what should we do? Should we close all the churches and send our priests out to do other work? Unquote. The life of the monastery's staretz itself alternated between moments of joy and melancholy. Who can escape such things? But Father John knew how to overcome depression. Quote, I wrote this letter with the greatest of difficulty. I dragged the pen over the paper as if it were a heavy crowbar. My soul is dried up and my heart is like stone. A state like this calls for patience. One has to wait for help from God. Lord have mercy. Unquote. 6. XII. 1946. A spiritual friendship. Yelena Axelyevna Armfelt was Father John's closest and most trusted spiritual child. In the post-war years, they corresponded almost weekly. Father John made the nature of this relationship quite clear. Quote, and since the friendship between us is purely spiritual, nothing that happens can ever harm it. Unquote. 5. XII. 1947. Quote, don't be shy, he insisted. Write to me every day if you wish. No one here will think it odd if you send me letters frequently. It is evident from what you write that you are downhearted. If I remember correctly, I wrote to you about this matter at the beginning of my letter on September 18th, 1945, and I also answered some other questions that you had. Read that letter again if you haven't thrown it away. Unquote. 27 II 1949. The importance of this correspondence for Father John is indicated by his statement that, quote, generally speaking, I share everything with you as I would with the closest of friends, unquote. And even more than this, quote, my attitude towards you has not changed at all. I am always ready to share with you the one thing needful. It is only with you that I can discuss this. I think you've noticed that yourself, unquote. 8 IX 1955. Father John was Yelena Axelyevna's father confessor and spiritual guide, but another development had also taken place in the course of time. Yelena Axelyevna had become the physician of Father John's soul, for the subject which could only be discussed with her was precisely this, the salvation of the soul. This was a strange situation, but true. Father John often complained in his letters that he had not found a like-minded person among the other monks with whom he could discuss spiritual matters and share the joys and sorrows of life. The reason for this unfortunate situation, he maintained, was his own pride. It is easy to see from his letters and teachings that he existed on such a different spiritual and intellectual plane from those around him that it would obviously be impossible to find anyone of a like mind among the monks who were more concerned with observing the letter of the law. But his dearth of monastic friends was made up for by his interesting and colorful circle of friends in the world, consisting of both cultured and uneducated people, and even artists. At times, Father John marveled at how learned his spiritual children were. Quote, sometimes I am troubled by the thought of why I, who am so uneducated, am carrying on correspondences with such people of culture. The most important part of the correspondence between Father John and Yelena Axelyevna was naturally the spiritual guidance which he gave her. He taught her and advised her on how to walk the path of a Christian in the light of the Scriptures and the sayings of the Holy Fathers, and consoled her in times of sorrow or depression. Quote, I feel all your sufferings in my heart. May the Lord give you strength in everything. It is good and spiritually right that you should not try to please people, and that you should act according to the dictates of your own conscience. Such a state of mind will give you peace in your soul. Don't despair. Our Lord Jesus Christ came on earth precisely for the sake of the unworthy. We must confess our faults and beg for his mercy, and he in his goodness will forgive us our sins. Amen. Unquote. 27 II 1949. The works of the Holy Fathers are not to be read as if they were just any kind of literature, and the staretz was anxious to point this out as well. Quote, Bishop Ignatius gives us good advice on how to read the Holy Fathers. You have the book, don't you? It is called Arena. We don't have it here in our library. Could you also send me the Moral Philosophy of St. Isaac the Syrian, the shorter edition? I think you have 2 copies of it, and we don't have many complete editions. Unquote. 27 II 1947. Naturally, other things were also spoken of in the confidential correspondence between the two. Each unburdened the sorrows of the heart and the anxieties of life to the other. These accumulated in the course of time as a result of little daily setbacks and led to a state of mental anguish. But told to the other, they became less onerous, and just the telling brought relief. They also discussed the problems of the communities in which each lived. Father John recounted events at the monastery and the joys and sorrows encountered there, and Yelena told him about what happened to her at work and at home. She often told him about what was going on at their church, and being an émigré parish, all manner of things did go on. People have their human weaknesses in parish affairs as they do in monasteries. When it was necessary to discuss the problems of individual people in their letters, Father John would often feel uneasy. He put it like this, quote, When we touch upon a particular person's weaknesses in our letters, we are not passing judgment by simply pointing out these weaknesses as part of the pastoral care of souls. When you have to speak with someone who is not of like mind, may God preserve you from revealing your inner self. You should share your inward experiences, both spiritual and sinful, only with people who are of a mind with you. Unquote. Father John's teachings were often very blunt and revealed the harsh truth of the situation, which meant that they were not always easy to accept, as the truth is frequently unpleasant. Quote, You are holding something against NN. That is bad and is a burden on the heart. Try to relieve the situation in some way. When we are not strong enough to make peace, we must call for help from God and from the Queen of Heaven. Pray for NN. Try with all your might to break the chains of disagreement. Examine yourself more closely, for this fault must lie with you too. Unquote. The Armfelds had an old woman, Alexandra Sergeyevna, living with them in their little house. She had begun to talk with Yelena Axelyevna's mother on the way home from church one day and had complained that she had nowhere to live. After a short while, she was allowed to come and live in the Armfelds' kitchen, where she then stayed for many years. Yelena Axelyevna naturally became impatient with her from time to time, and would say something thoughtless to her. She would then own up to what she had done in a letter to Father John, and he would reply with instructions such as, quote, Try and improve your manners. Stop giving Alexandra Sergeyevna rude answers. Unquote. The same letter also contained another reprimand. Quote, If you have read about the holy places in Jerusalem and know all about them, you don't need to go and listen to NN's tales about her travels there. It's very rude to go around saying that you don't want to hear about such holy places from that person's mouth. Repent. God will forgive you, but don't speak like that again. Try to mend your ways, purge the wretched pit of your soul, so that you won't utter such ugly words again. Unquote. Once Father John even imposed an epithemia, or penance, on Yelena Axelyevna, when, without the staretz's permission or blessing, she had urged her own parish priest, Father Vladimir, to write to Father John about his problems and concerns. The idea as such was a good one, but the fact that it had been done without his blessing upset Father John greatly. Quote, Your advising Father Vladimir to write to me about his troubles was not a good thing to do. This is your epithemia. Repeat the Jesus prayer with obeisances 33 times, and prostrate yourself 10 times to the Mother of God and 10 times to St. John the Baptist. I don't think in any case that Father Vladimir will write to me, and from what I know of him, he wouldn't find my advice to his liking even if he did." Unquote. He was also prepared to divulge a secret to his faithful child, although it is no longer a secret matter today. Quote, "Agnia was here for 3 weeks, but left in tears. She had been trying to enter a convent all her life, but for certain reasons she had never been able to do so. She took her vows before me in secret and assumed the name of Eupraxia. She was truly very happy. Don't say anything about her consecration to anyone else. Let it remain a secret." Unquote. 3. VIII, 1949. When the spiritual children living in the world wanted to give pleasure to their beloved staretz, they would do so by sending food parcels to the monastery. Paula Maximovna was a good dressmaker and used to send him clothes, including items for his habit as a schema monk. Quote, "Thank you for the parcel, and thank you to Paula for the cowl. If you come in the summer, I will wear it to welcome you." Unquote. 25 I, 1952. The schema monk's habit also included an apron-like garment furnished with a cross, and he had been sent one of these at one time. Quote, "My sincerest thanks for everything. The apron turned out just right and hangs very well on the shoulders. Who knew how to cut it so well?" Unquote. 2. III, 1947. Icons were also sent to the monastery as remembrances and tokens of affection. Quote, "When you come, bring me an icon of the Mother of God of Kazan that Ina painted, and I will give you a Kazan icon from the skeet of St. John the Baptist. It's very well done." Unquote. 7 V, 1955. Father John often included pieces of altar bread or prosphora with his letters, pieces which had been taken in remembrance of them at communion. Sometimes he would send them direct from the bakery so that they could be eaten at meals. Quote, "I have sent you some rusks made of dried rye bread and a large prosphoron which has not been consecrated. You can have it with the tea." Unquote. 14 I, 1954. Yelena Axelyevna also received other gifts from Father John. Quote, "I am sending you my pocket watch. I don't need it and I don't want to sell it." Unquote. And also medicines in case of illness. Quote, "Father André has prepared this. I showed it to Father Yeronim, and he said that it is for constipation and that I shouldn't send it to you. He says that it would be better for you to go to a doctor first. I'm sending it all the same, though. Take it, should you ever suffer from constipation." Unquote. 5 XII, 1947. Yelena Axelyevna faithfully asked the staret's advice and blessing in all situations of her life. After her mother's death, she had considered taking in another lodger, like Sergeyevna, but Father John advised her against it. Quote, "As for the woman you mention, whom I also know, decide for yourself, but when there is a choice between two evils, choose the lesser. In my opinion, it is better not to take her to live with you than to live together and be led astray." Unquote. 30 III, 1949. A few years later, there was talk of two other female friends of Yelena Axelyevna moving into the apartment, one of whom, Paula Maximovna, still lives there, and this time Father John gave his blessing. The only problem was space. The apartment consisted of only one room and an alcove. There was a small kitchen as well, of course, but Alexandra Sergeyevna slept there. From his room in the monastery, Father John considered how Yelena's flat could be organized to accommodate both Lydia and Paula. Quote, "I'm thinking about your home now and trying to work out where to put Paula and Lydia. The divan takes up a lot of room. Couldn't it be moved somewhere else? Then the table could be put in its place, the bookcase could be moved slightly, and another bed could be placed next to the one I slept in. That should give them the space they need. Let Sergeyevna stay where she is. If she doesn't like it, she will have to put up with it. Yet one must not hope that she might die, for such a thought would be a sin." Unquote. 23 I, 1955. The staretz also gave his blessing for the acquisition of a radio and a telephone in the Armfeld's home. Quote, "We have 6 radios in the monastery. Why shouldn't you have one? In these times of anxiety, you can hear about all kinds of events. I often ask about such things from those who follow the affairs in the world. It is also a good thing to have a telephone. Make use of both for your own good. Don't be embarrassed about them." Unquote. 4 III, 1957. Even now, at over 80, Yelena Axelyevna asks herself when confronted by new things and ideas, what would Father John have advised me to do in this situation? Other spiritual children. Yelena Armfeldt was by no means alone as a spiritual child of Father John's, for his flock consisted of a wide circle of people longing for a deeper spiritual life in Finland and elsewhere, stretching across the world wherever Russian émigrés had been scattered to. Father John tried to answer the letters from all of them for as long as his strength allowed. In the summer, those who lived near at hand liked to visit New Valamo and meet their beloved staretz in person. Among his closest friends was the writer Tito Colliander from Helsinki, his wife, the artist Ina Colliander, and their children. They still treasure the precious memory of Father John in their hearts. Tito Colliander has incorporated vivid, accurate descriptions of the staretz' personality and teaching in his works. Father John was a figure of great importance in the life of the Collianders at that time, especially when things were at their most difficult. In an article in Russian published in the book Muistoria Valamosta, Ina Colliander admits that Father John, quote, set their family on its feet. Father John wrote to Yelena Axelyevna about his relationship with the Collianders. Quote, one can share everything with Ina, for she has suffered many sorrows, and now she and her husband are applying themselves to prayer. May the Lord further them in their work. Titushka has begun to read the teachings of the Holy Fathers with great care. Send him the booklet by Isaac the Syrian to read, as it contains a systemic account of the spiritual life. And if you have the letters of Bishop Theophan on the spiritual life, send him them too. He will benefit from reading them. If you can't find them, let me know and I'll send him my own copy. I think that as a writer, it will be useful for him to read some of the works of St. John Chrysostom. What do you think? Unquote. 11. XII, 1948. The Collianders were regular visitors to Valamo, either the whole family or one of the parents at a time, coming to seek peace and quiet. They would often sit with Father John in his cell, drinking tea and talking. Their friendship was not disturbed by the fact that their views on life and on spiritual questions occasionally differed. Quote, when Titushka was last here, I said to him while we were drinking tea together, some time ago a professed monk died here and he didn't even have a cross around his neck. One monk came up to me and said, can we remember him in the prayers for the deceased if he didn't wear a cross, seldom went to church, and was a poor believer? I said to Tito, look, this is the kind of thinking and speech of the letter which kills the spirit. If this monk had been carrying the spirit in his heart, he would not have said that. And Tito answered, now at last I understand you. Unquote. 19 IV 1956. Tito Colliander played a decisive part in the publications of the collection of Father John's letters, later translated into English under the title Christ is in Our Midst, Letters from a Russian Monk. Being a writer himself, he was able to edit the book and also successfully overcame the many external difficulties which arise in a venture of that kind. Another of Father John's children in Helsinki was the artist Martha Platanoff. She belonged to the Neglik family of government officials from Karelia and worked as a wardrobe mistress at the Swedish theater. She did particularly staunch work in the post-war years, furnishing the new Orthodox churches and chapels with icons. Father John paid her a visit whenever he came to Helsinki, just as he also made a point of calling on Anna Verubova, remembered as lady-in-waiting to the last empress of Russia. The staretz aptly referred to her as, quote, a timber from a sunken ship. Yelena Axelyevna's living companion, Paula Maximovna, used to write to Father John even though she had Father Mikhail as her confessor, and the elderly Alexandra Sergeyevna, who lived in the same apartment, also sent him letters and received replies from him or greetings via the others. She frequently complained of Yelena Axelyevna's smoking and wondered at Father John's inability to stop her. Yelena herself suffered on account of this little foible of hers and eventually gave it up completely. The staretz had many other spiritual children in Helsinki as well, and they all wanted him to visit them when he was there. This was naturally not possible and sometimes led to awkward situations and emotional outbursts, which had to be straightened out later in letters between Papanemi and the capital. Father John also had his spiritual followers among the nuns at the convent of Lintula, and I had the pleasure one June day in 1966 of sitting in the cell of Sister Marina listening to her reading the staretz's letters, which she treasured greatly. I did not have any very clear mental picture at that time of either Father John or his letters, with the wealth of their extraordinary ecclesiastical terminology, but it did not worry me. Just the situation of listening to them was a valuable experience for me and made a deep impression which has remained with me ever since. The convent cell filled with icons, the holy silence all around, and the sick woman sitting up in her bed and reading the letters from the staretz in a devout voice. Father John would sometimes mention his spiritual children living further away. Lyudmila Vaman tells me of the difficulties of her life in England. I am praying to the holy martyr Barbara, she writes, that she will supply me with a priest before my death. Then later, I am trying to overcome my fondness for sweet things. Lyudmila is deeply religious and is afraid to die without an absolution. May the Lord grant her wisdom. Unquote. 22 II 1950. He also received letters from France and Germany. Quote, I had a letter from Tamara in Germany. Her little daughter has burned my last letter on the stove. Tamara has wept over the loss and written down what she could remember of it. She keeps all my letters so that she can read them over and over again. You made a copy of the letter. Perhaps you could send it to her. I am quite overwhelmed with all these letters, but I have to keep writing. Unquote. 3 VIII 1949. Yelena Axelyevna often acted as a kind of secretary to Father John, especially in the case of the letters he sent abroad. She would copy them and help in posting them. Sometimes he would ask her opinion of certain letters. Quote, I am sending you a letter that has come from America. Read it and write down straight away whatever reply God puts in your heart. I will answer the letter, but I want to hear your opinion. Unquote. 17 III 1950. In his last years, Father John did not have the strength to answer the letters anymore, and he would often ask Yelena to write on his behalf, tell the person his news, and explain that he was no longer able to carry on correspondence with his beloved children. One letter in the collection, Christ is in our midst, is addressed to a woman involved in a mixed marriage. The situation was not exactly what we would think of by this, for in Finland we would immediately imagine that the husband was Lutheran. This was not the case, however. Galena Hess, who had moved to America from Estonia, was married to a Jew. It was not an easy matter for a Russian Orthodox daughter-in-law to come into a Jewish family which was closely attached to its own traditions. The upbringing of their son caused particular difficulties. Galena wanted him to grow up as an Orthodox Christian, but her husband also had to reconcile this with the opposing view from his own mother. Father John felt great sympathy for Galena, whom he had known since the days of old Valamo. Quote, once again, poor Galena has stopped writing to me. I wrote to her aunt in Germany to ask what has happened to her. Unquote. He gave her detailed advice on how she should live, being faithful to her husband and respecting his family, but at the same time remaining true to her own church. And he even gave her permission to allow her son to be circumcised. Galena's existence was not all troubles, however. Quote, I had a letter from Galena. She is delighted because her son is going to church. He receives Holy Communion like the adults and kisses the chalice and the icons so that the church rings out. At home, he imitates the deacon and sings until the whole house echoes. In other words, it means that all is well with Galena. She wants me to write to her and promises to send me a good medicine for pains in the hands and feet. Unquote. Galena did not forget her beloved staretz when she married into a rich family, and she and her husband often sent medicines for him and for the other monks. Some years after Father John's death, Galena wrote to Yelena Axelyevna and asked her to kneel in prayer at the grave on her behalf as a token of her gratitude. Father John also had his correspondence across the Gulf of Finland, in Estonia, and in the Petitsa convent, which was still functioning. These again were friends of his from the old Valamo days. Quote, I am going to write next to the nuns at Petitsa. They thirst for my letters. Although it's difficult for me to write nowadays, I must still try. Unquote. 24 I 1954. Yelena Alexeyevna's visits to Valamo. Quote, when you left here, I watched the boat move away from the shore, but I was too shy to wave because some of the fathers were standing next to me. I gazed at the boat until it disappeared from sight, and was very sad when I returned to my cell, as if I had lost something very dear and precious to me. We are human beings, after all, and our human nature reminds us of its existence. We had very little time to talk about the salvation of the soul, for I was ever occupied with one thing or another. And when there was time, then I was tired and my train of thought wasn't always too clear. I hope that you will wipe away all my shortcomings with Christian love. Although our conversations were short, I benefited greatly from your candor. You wouldn't have noticed this, of course. Generally speaking, our conversations were a meeting of two minds with similar thoughts, conversations of a kind that are seldom possible with either lay people or monks. For some reason, I am not happy with this letter. I wanted to throw it into the central heating furnace, but then I thought that you can do that just as well. I beg you to forgive the poor language and the confused contents. I pray for God's blessing on you. Your unworthy companion in prayer, Schema Igumen John, unquote, 14 VIII 1945. Yelena Alexeyevna usually went to Valamo during every summer holiday, either alone or with Paula Maximovna. The trip to the monastery and the meeting with Father John were the highlights of her year. She still thinks back with love and nostalgia to those golden summer weeks in the natural beauty of Valamo. In the early years, there were no bus connections to the monastery, and the pilgrims came by boat from Kipio. But later, the regular boat service was discontinued and replaced with train and bus routes. Quote, when you come here, take the mail train. It arrives at Yoyarvi at noon. The bus goes to the station on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays to fetch the mail, and you can come onto it on the crossroads. From there, it is a walk of 4 versts to the monastery. Let me know when you're coming, and I will be at the crossroads to meet you. The express train gets into Yoyarvi at 8 o'clock, which means that you would have to wait 4 hours for the bus. Unquote. 18 v. 1947. Visits to the monastery were only possible with the igumen's blessing, and so Yelena Alexeyevna wrote to him. Father John conveyed the igumen's greetings to her in his own letter. Quote, I gave the Father Igumen your letter. He promised his blessing for you to come here and promised to give you the same cell as last time. She does snore so, he said, but that doesn't matter. When you want to come, write to Father Symphorian, and he will send a horse to the crossroads. Father Lucas is still in the sanatorium. Unquote. One summer, nothing came of Yelena Alexeyevna's visit to Valamo at all. Her mother was taken ill and in such a weak condition because of her advanced age that Yelena could not leave her unattended. And so the highlight of the year and the monastery holiday which she had been dreaming about for days, weeks, and months had to be foregone. Yelena was shattered and stricken with depression. Father John tried to console his unhappy friend. Quote, I was waiting for you on Thursday, and they sent a horse to the crossroads for you. We were waiting, but you didn't come. I was going to send a horse on Saturday again, but then suddenly I received your letter. What can one do? Suffer and trust in the Lord's will in everything, not in words, but in the feelings of one's heart. I share in your sufferings, and pray that your own health will hold out, calling upon him to grant you success and assistance. May the Lord protect you. When you go to the city and begin work again, your inner sufferings will gradually calm down. It happens like that. Even though you didn't come to the monastery, we still have our common bond of prayer and can converse through our letters. Try with all your strength to calm your mother down and bear with her in her weakness. Then God will also bear with you in your weakness. Unquote. 26 VI 1948. Pilgrims were particularly eager to come to the monastery on religious feast days, one of which was the Feast of the Transfiguration of Christ, celebrated on August 19th according to the old calendar, which was still adhered to in earlier times. Yelena Alexeyevna and Paula Maximovna recollected how the monks used to go to the sauna on the day before and plait their long, newly washed hair in braids, so that it would be clean and fluffy for the feast day. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes. Father Pamva was especially splendidly dressed, in a pink cassock. Yelena and Paula tried to wear something festive and elegant for this important feast. The monks carried berries and fruit from the gardens into the church in laundry baskets to be blessed after the service, as is the custom, and the Igumen often invited guests to tea. Father Lucas, who was in charge of looking after the guests, would also serve them tea sometimes, with some of the monastery's white bread. Once it happened that Father Lucas became convinced that the ladies had been at the monastery for long enough, and remarked one day, "Isn't it time for the girls to go back to Helsinki?" Each naturally went to complain about this to her own staretz, Yelena to Father John, and Paula to Father Mikhail. But both of them simply said, quote, "All you can do is go, if you are told to." Unquote. But then Father Lucas changed his mind and asked them to remain for a while longer, and they again went to their confessors to tell them the joyful news. The confessors continued in the same vein as before, however. Quote, "You will have to leave if Father Lucas has once said so." Unquote. At the moment when they were actually going, the vigil was in progress in the church, and Father Lucas was at the altar. He was still feeling upset at having driven the girls away too soon, and opened a window, leaned out, and waved to them to wish them a good journey as a gesture of reconciliation. One problem was that they didn't have enough money for their return journey, so Father John lent them the money. They went by boat from the Carvalho Canal to Savonlinna, and from there to Helsinki, worrying all the time whether their money would last out, but fortunately it did. Although Yelena Axelyevna never traveled anywhere other than New Valamo, she had acquaintances who sometimes made journeys abroad. When she told Father John about them, he suspected that the spiritual child of his was also longing to see the world. Quote, "Sonuta is pleased with her trip to Italy. One must learn a lot from seeing places which one has read about in books. Are you thinking of going there too? The trouble is that it takes a lot of time and money. I know a way that is closer, from which one can learn and benefit just as much. In fact, it is very close indeed, as the Lord pointed out to us." Luke 17, verse 21. "I suggest you try that at once." Unquote. 26 v. 1953. Once again, the summer's pilgrimage to Valamo was over, and beautiful memories of it were fresh in the minds of all of them. It was time for Father John to reflect on his dear child's visit. Quote, "Everything that has been started must come to an end. Only God himself is without beginning and without end. So Yelena planned her journey and counted the time until she set out, first in months, then in weeks, and finally in days. She waited, she arrived, she stayed here, and she left. And it was all as if in a dream. When we think about the past, it always seems to have gone by so quickly, but even 1 year ahead seems a very long time. So it is that our whole life passes in expectation." Unquote. Father John in Helsinki. Quote, "God-fearing Yulia and Yelena, I hasten to write to you at once. My heartfelt thanks for your hospitality. I felt more at home with you than with my own relatives, although we did gossip rather too much at times. I can still picture your home in my mind, the table and the sofa which made up Yelena's cell, the small corridor, and the kitchen where I had my meals, and everything else, as clearly as if it were still before my eyes. We arrived at the monastery at 7 o'clock in the morning, having sat waiting for the train in Pieksämäki for 10 hours. We covered 20 kilometers in 3.5 hours in a horse-drawn sleigh at 10 degrees below zero. They had brought a long fur coat for me, which kept me warm during the ride. My fingers and toes went numb, but they didn't freeze. As soon as I arrived at the monastery, I went to sauna to wash off the city dirt. I was pleased with my journey to the city, very pleased, but the return journey was a sad one. Apart from the fact that we had to travel for 2 nights, a new unpleasant incident arose. Father Gennady had come to meet us at noon, but because the train was late, he had to wait until 3 o'clock on Saturday morning. During this time, the horse disappeared. It had been tied up in the stable, but the rope had come undone, the door was open, and the horse had bolted. Nobody knows where. Whether it broke free by itself or whether it was stolen is still a mystery. They are searching for it now. It was the best horse we had, and what is more, it belonged to someone else, and had been lent to the monastery for a certain time. We were brought back to the monastery by the forester's horse. All kinds of tales are going around among the brethren. One said to me, "You just travel around and lose horses." It's not long since another monk has said, "Surely there isn't anyone in this monastery who could be angry with you." And now they have found one. People are only human. One day they praise you, the next day they're cursing you. But I'm not worried, as I truly believe that this could not have happened without God willing it. When the Father Igumen mentioned that the horse had been lost, I replied, "One horse is nothing compared with what we have already lost. By the grace of God, I am keeping well. My heart is quite all right, and I am at peace. Glory to God in everything, as our sweet-tongued St. John Chrysostom used to say." Unquote. 1945. Father John visited Helsinki fairly regularly in the post-war years, although his real destination was Porvoo. There was an old people's home for Russian immigrants nearby, and a hieromonk from Valamo was often invited there to hold services. Father John was often sent to do this. On his way to Porvoo, he would take the opportunity to be in Helsinki for a while and visit his dear friends. He would always stay with the Armfeldts for at least a couple of days, and would remember their home and their hospitality with affection when he returned to the monastery. Quote, "I can't find words enough to thank you for the good and agreeable care you take of me, who am most unworthy of such treatment. Your modest meal was more delicious for me than any served from the plentiful tables of the rich. The little kitchen and the gas stove, Julia busy frying blinis, and her daughter helping her. It was all so pleasant to watch, and I felt very happy. Your way of life is pleasing to me. You live like the first-century Christians. I am saying this because it is what it felt like to me. I am sending you a little parcel. Please don't refuse it. And I am also sending you 200 marks. My visit cost you a lot of money. I still have 1,200 marks left. There is one thing that I earnestly hope for, that I might be a tiny star in the heavens. Then you would be big, shining stars. The apostle likens holy people to lighted candles in the sky. Our horse, by the way, was found at a farmhouse 15 kilometers away from the station. My thanks to the estimable Julia for her good, kind letter. Schema Igumen John, 1945. The following year's visit to the Armfeldts left the Staretz with equally pleasant memories. Dear friends in Christ, Yulia and Yelena, Christ is in our midst. My spirit was united with yours, and we became like close relatives. It was wonderful to visit you. From time to time, I remembered Yulia getting up early in the morning, airing the room, making the bed and clinking the dishes in the kitchen, busying herself there and making food for Yelena. Then Yelena, too, sets about her chores, mopping the floor with a damp cloth. All the while I am still resting in my soft bed. All this returns as a visible image before my eyes, for imagination and memory are one and the same inner feeling." Unquote. Yelena and Father John had talked a lot during his visit about the activities of the Russian Students' Club, with which Yelena's life was closely bound up. It was particularly important to her, and Father John also saw the necessity of the club operating on a purely religious basis, and tried to help and encourage her in her running of it. He also gave her useful practical advice, and in particular comforted her at moments when it caused her problems. Quote, "Try to act wisely with the members of the club. Pray before each meeting that the Lord will help you to carry it through in peace and in a manner that will bring benefit to everyone. Don't be put out when disagreements arise, for each of us expresses things in words as they are in his heart. Make it a rule that you will not say anything in anger, for when one is angry, one is likely to make mistakes." Unquote. 26 v. 1953. Quote, "Run the club wisely. The purposes of its meetings are good, and it doesn't matter at all if differences of opinion arise sometimes. As for yourself, try to keep calm, if at all possible." Unquote. 11 x. 1953. Quote, "I wrote to you before, and I will repeat it again. When you say something to somebody for the good of his soul, say it in a simple way. You don't have to try consciously to make an impression. That can be achieved by God's grace without our efforts. You know, if a listener listens with faith, he will benefit from what he has heard. But if he listens out of curiosity, there is simply no way of knowing what to say to him. Keep on with running the club, even if attendances are poor. You read things and discuss them. Of course, only people who are interested in the spiritual life will come and listen to spiritual discussions. Things spiritually can generally only be attained with effort." Unquote. 24 xi. 1955. Father John visited many friends in their homes when he was in Helsinki, and usually it was Miss Lydia Raylo who helped him to travel from one place to the next, as she had a suitable car and many of her relatives were in any case faithful friends of his. Miss Raylo also looked after him at New Valamo for several weeks when he was on his deathbed. On one occasion, Lydia Raylo was with Father John when he came to the Armfeldts, and as if they were going into the porch, they were accosted by a drunk who asked them for money. Lydia replied sharply that she didn't have any, and Father John kept silent. When they were inside and going to the lift, he turned to Lydia and looked her straight in the eyes and asked, "Do you really have no money at all with you?" Lydia replied that of course she had, but she wouldn't give it to that man, as he would only go and spend it on more drink. Father John disagreed. But think, it might have been his last bottle before beginning a new life. Yelena was reprimanded for an incident of the same kind in a letter. Quote, "Do you remember when we were walking down the street and there was a little girl standing on the corner with a Salvation Army bowl in her hand collecting money? You said something sharply to her. That was quite the wrong thing to do. She was so small, and without doubt she was doing good work. There is no need from a spiritual point of view to find out who it is who is asking. The Lord's command is that we should give, even if it is to a millionaire. Let each man think as he pleases, but I will keep to my opinion." Unquote. 9 IX 1956. When conversations at the Armfelds went on into the late hours, no one was able to concentrate on evening prayers any longer. Then Father John would settle the matter to his host's satisfaction by announcing, quote, "Go to bed now. Don't worry about your prayers tonight. I will say them for you." Unquote. Yelena Axelyevna's mother began to suffer from loss of memory with old age. Once, when she was at home alone, she had filled the bread oven with firewood. Fortunately, no accident happened, but now her daughter was afraid to leave her in the house alone for a whole day. It was Father John who devised a way of keeping her out of the kitchen. He printed the words, quote, "Julia must not go into the kitchen," in large letters on a piece of cardboard, and fastened it to the kitchen door. The trick worked. After that, Julia no longer went into the kitchen, and her daughter was spared all the worry. As Father John's strength declined, his trips to Helsinki and Porvoo came to an end, although there were times when he felt quite well and had to compromise. Quote, "In order to avoid idle talk among the monks, I won't go to Porvoo. Someone is bound to say that he can't conduct services there, but he can quite happily go off to Porvoo." Unquote. 24/3/1955. Although his visits to Helsinki were at an end, he had his beautiful memories of them to console him, and he was able to communicate his warmest thoughts by means of his letters from Papaniemi. Quote, "I'll stop writing now and prepare for bed. The temperature outside is negative 25 degrees Celsius, and in my cell it is plus 25 degrees Celsius. There is enough firewood put aside, and the heating is working well. The radiators are burning hot. It must be pretty cold in your house. Wrap up warm and go to sleep with a prayer. May the Lord preserve you and your mother. May the Lord help you. May the Lord deliver you from everlasting suffering." Unquote. 30 XII 1957. Visions and Premonitions. Quote, "You write that you have been reading what the Holy Fathers say about dreams, that if a dream recurs, it will come true. One should not believe in dreams. St. Barsanuphius the Great writes, 'A lie that has appeared once can do so 3 times, or even more.'" Unquote. 19 II 1948. Father John took a critical view of dreams and their interpretation, in accordance with the sober teaching of the Church. On the other hand, he believed firmly in the existence of evil spirits, and recounted his own experiences in one letter to justify his beliefs. Once, while living in the skeet of St. John the Baptist before the war, he had been awake in the small hours of the night and had heard, quote, "someone walking about in the entrance hall. I clearly heard footsteps, although I remembered well having locked the outer door. Cold shivers began to run down my spine, and the cat arched its back and its fur stood on end, as if waiting for the door to open and someone to step inside. I took a lamp, went into the hall, and searched everywhere, but there was no one there. Anyone who doesn't believe will say that it was a hallucination, of course, but it certainly wasn't. It was evil spirits moving about there." Unquote. 11 XI 1954. Yelena Axelyevna had written to Father John about her own supernatural experiences, and the staretz told her of similar incidents that had occurred in the monastery. Quote, "I told you that Hieromonk Pioni used to hear voices and would speak with them a lot. Occasionally he heard a voice saying, 'I am the holy bishop, so-and-so,' and he would bow down to him. Later, he no longer paid any attention to these voices, although he continued to hear them, and they would speak to him less. It may be some kind of sickness in the head that affects us. Schema monk Nikolai used to have hallucinations. He would see various things and hear voices. Then it would all suddenly disappear." Unquote. 24 IX 1952. But the old man certainly used to sense something strange at nights from time to time. Quote, "I, too, sometimes feel afraid at nights that there is someone in my cell. When it happens, I concentrate on my prayers, make the sign of the cross, and recite the Gospels, the parts that I know of by heart." Unquote. 1 IX 1953. Quote, "One monk told me, 'For a long time there has been a knocking in my corner at 2 o'clock every morning, but today it was on the window frame and loud, too.' He thought it was an angel, but I said, 'No, it's not an angel but an evil spirit. There won't be any more after this.' And so it was. The knocking stopped." Unquote. 17 IX 1953. In the daytime, when there was no fear of the terrors of the night, one could freely discuss such strange events with visitors to the monastery. Quote, "A certain layman told me about his life and said that he lives well and that he has prophetic dreams which come true. I invited him to my cell and we talked. He said that if someone lives badly, his dreams will also be bad, but anyone who is good will have good dreams. Naturally, I talked with him quite a lot. A certain person said to me, 'I am holy.' I didn't have time to speak with him, but now I would say, 'Stupid people like yourself are not holy.' Ionova has now given up painting. I said to her, 'Your pictures are like strands of macaroni. There's no sense in them,' and she began to laugh. We too have people who can look into the future, but prophets are not honored in their own country. Do you know Brother Boris? He has just turned 80, and now he has started coming to church in a short, sleeveless cassock and a kamilavka on his head. He says he will die this year. He has received a revelation about it." 22 VIII 1955. I went to see Brother Boris. He has a bad cough. He was talking about a miracle-working icon that he has in his cell. Then he showed me his diary. I asked him to give it to me to read in my cell, and he did so gladly. I came back to my cell and read it. There were a lot of interesting things in it, and it was fluently written. His parents had been merchants in St. Petersburg and the first members of the guild. He had written a lot about the visions he had at night, both in his sleep and while lying awake, but there was very few quotations from the Holy Fathers. He had written only about his own life. For some reason I am doubtful about his visions. Might they not be his own imagination or just senile delusions? Boris claimed to have seen the Mother of God on a number of occasions. He spoke about one of these. Once at night I was resting with my eyes open and reciting the Jesus prayer. The door was locked. Then I saw with my own eyes the Divine Lady step inside and come to my side. She looked upon me, a sinner, and smiled. Then she disappeared in a whirl into the miracle-working icon. When I was praying that night, I heard a voice within me saying that when I reach 80 years in 1956, I should prepare for eternity. How can one believe in his vision of the Mother of God? She appeared to Saint Sergei of Radonej, and Saint Mikhai was standing close by at the time, but he put his hands over his eyes, unable to look at her. Boris seems to have been able to gaze on the all-holy Virgin and Mother of God with admiration. I returned the diary to Father Boris, and it turned out that it had not even been written by him, but by some schoolgirl from a lyceum. Boris had given her the manuscript. I had wondered how he could write with such learned language. I went to see Father Mikhail, and we talked about one thing and another. He understands Father Boris a little. He said, "In any case, I am skeptical about his visions. He says he sees them, but his talk is of quite a different order. He discusses politics and is interested in current affairs. You can draw your own conclusions from that." Father Boris told me, "I heard a voice saying, 'Write a diary. It will be of use to many people.' I must say that I got very little use out of his visions and dreams, and there is certainly no teaching to be found in them." Unquote. 8 IX 1955. Then Father John spoke about his own personal experiences of supernatural sensations. Quote, "I was living in the skeet and was singing together with another monk. When we started to recite the hexapsalms, he became absorbed in his own thoughts. I felt these thoughts in the back of my mind, and wondered about nudging him in the back and saying, 'Why are you thinking about evil things?' I didn't do it, but I did find out afterwards that my presentiment had been correct. I had some medicine for colds, and on one occasion I had the feeling that the monk in the next cell wanted to come and ask for some. I took the medicine to him. "How did you know that I was just about to come and ask for it?" he said. I didn't reply. Sometimes it can be a pure coincidence that what you say to another person is just what he is thinking at that moment. Then it becomes difficult to tell whether it is chance or the work of the devil. Perhaps, after all, it's the work of the devil if it leads an inexperienced person into thinking that he has the gift of prophecy." Unquote. The staretz was also ready to put forward the church's position on clairvoyance. Prophesying clairvoyance is quite a different matter for holy people, for by God's grace they have cleansed their souls of all lusts and see things with the eyes of the soul. One example of this: the blessed Stephen was traveling past the Lavra of the Trinity, 12 versts away from his monastery, and gave a bow as he went, as a salutation to its igumen Sergei. At that moment the monks were at their meal, and the blessed Sergei immediately announced, "Arise, brethren, and bow, for the blessed Stephen is greeting us." It is still the custom to stand and bow during meals at that Lavra, in memory of this miracle. While I lived in St. Petersburg, there was once an elderly woman who came into the chapel to pray. She had an ability to see in her mind who was coming to visit her, and so was able to prepare for it in advance. She was also able to see where her husband was, in what company, and how he was behaving. She had told Father John of Kronstadt about this, and he had said, "There is nothing sinful in this, but neither is it of any benefit to you," and at once the gift vanished from her. Unquote. 6 II, 1956. Father John regarded himself as unworthy of seeing any visions or having any deep spiritual experiences, but he did do so. The author, Tito Colliander, recounts one experience which illustrates the sensitivity of his inner spiritual being in his article Christilicis ja Culturi. Quote, "A couple of summers ago, an old monk of Valamo, of great spiritual experience, accompanied me to the crossroads at Papaniemi. We walked unhurriedly, talking at leisure. Then suddenly the monk stopped and looked into the distance as if searching for something. 'It's as if someone were praying here,' he said in amazement. There was a woman walking about 100 meters behind us, and we stopped to wait for her. The monk addressed her, but she didn't understand him, as he spoke in Russian, and I had to translate. 'Were you praying just now?' The woman was evidently taken aback. 'Yes, as a matter of fact, I was. I was reciting the Jesus prayer, repeating it as I walked along.' 'Yes, I thought so,' the monk said quite simply." Reflections on the Ascetic Life. Quote, "On the whole, it is difficult to live with those who keep to the letter of the law. They simply do not have any idea about the teachings of the Holy Fathers. The letter of the law becomes an ingrained habit. Naturally, God's verdict is not the same as man's, nor does he look at the act but rather at the intention with which it was done. Much is required of the person to whom much is given, while he who has been given little will have little required of him. A person who unintentionally does wrong will be judged differently from one who has done so on purpose. A monk once came to me in despair. 'No,' he said, 'I will not go to paradise. I am reading the biography of the saints Vasily and Fyodora. How can we ever account for everything?' 'Do not despair,' I replied. 'Start working for your own salvation and improving your life. Remember how ye shouted at Maria, and what wicked things you said to her. Stop doing that, and you will be saved.' But the monk only burst out angrily, 'That woman should be whipped,' and began to slander her again, saying all the things she had done to him. It was truly difficult for me to listen to him. It's sometimes very difficult for me. There's simply no one with whom I can share my inner feelings. They are ruled by the law and understand nothing of the inner spiritual life. Some people talk a lot, but only about what they know and have learned. They are taken up with the external letter, and they look at the spiritual life from the point of view of the outward life. External asceticism is necessary, of course, but one shouldn't stop at that, for it is not a virtue in itself, but only a means of attaining virtue. Not everyone understands that. It's depressing to talk to people who only follow the letter of the law, for the letter kills the spirit, and talking to such people about spiritual matters is likely to destroy one's inner peace. One should try to be prudent and cut the conversation short. Because of either my pride or my spiritual blindness, I simply can't understand why there is no one among the monks who can act as my advisor, with whom I could share my inner feelings. I love to read the Holy Fathers, for they point the way to the kingdom of heaven. They reveal our passions and our struggle against them down to the last detail. I read their teachings and am amazed by them and filled with admiration. I simply can't tear myself away from them, but I am trying to steer clear of all kinds of discussions. I have lived in the monastery since I was 16, but I have not been taught the one thing needful. I have been taught only outward behavior. If you drink tea after evening prayers, it's 50 prostrations, beer 12, and water 3. That was all the advice we had from our elders. And even now the older monks still say that the startzi told us not to drink tea after pravilo. But for some reason I haven't found any who have had a profound understanding of the contents of the Holy Father's teachings. The news has just come to me that a certain hero monk said of me in the kitchen, "That's what comes of practicing the Jesus prayer." When I am alone and have nothing to do, or when I'm taking a walk, I think over what I have read. The mind can never be idle. It must always have something to occupy it. If you don't give it something spiritual to think about, it will wander through the events of this world. Prayer and meditation, only these two can stop our thoughts from racing. You write that all you can do is sleep. That's good. It means you don't have to take sleeping pills. You are not the only one in a bad state of depression, though. I am also in its grip. At times it takes such a hold that I don't know what to do next. Everything gets out of hand, and my heart is like a stone, quite numb. It was not for nothing that the Holy Fathers used to carry stones from one place to another at times like these. I have been overcome by a kind of indifference, and look upon everything as if it was just a passing phase. Life passes by like a fast-flowing river, carrying with it loaded sailing ships, small boats, sometimes steamships full of passengers, and all kinds of other craft. So our lives rush at high speeds towards eternity. I looked forward to your coming, now it's over. I looked forward to the Metropolitan's visit, he has been and gone. So our whole life passes by while we are waiting for things. I have repapered my cell. It has turned out quite well. Now it's light and pleasant in here. From time to time I have a great urge to live a life of asceticism and self-denial, but unfortunately, in my case, it never goes further than an intention. The deed is nothing worth speaking of. N.N. said very aptly that I don't even look like a schema monk. I entirely agree. Unquote. Quote, when I read the teachings of the Holy Fathers, I simply blush. I read a lot, but understand very little. But there is still hope. Even though I have lived an unworthy life, if I take consolation from the teaching of chapter 20 of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, glory be to God in his great mercy. I was coming quietly into my cell when a monk intercepted me and said, "We had a man in our village who was very poor. He had a horse, but a very bad one. He took it to fetch firewood, but it was scarcely able to pull the load." I listened to him without saying anything, then came into my cell and burst out laughing. I wasn't criticizing him, for I knew that what he said to me was simply the next stage in his train of thought, as monks when they are in the church and preoccupied only with memories of the past. Our thoughts are nothing but fantasies arising from worldly emotions. Real orthodoxy is to be found in Russia. Metropolitan Georgi celebrated a service here with 18 others to assist him. It was very impressive. You will have heard more about his journey here at home. I will simply say that after 20 years of division, Valamo Monastery is once more united and has joined the Russian Orthodox Church. Our celebrations here lasted 3 days. Now we can give praise to God with one mouth and one heart. Unquote. 1945. After Finland had gained independence and the Finnish Orthodox Church was formed, the monastery of Valamo was forced by external pressure to change to the Gregorian calendar. The majority of the brethren were against this change, and it led to endless conflicts, with the monks divided into 2 camps, supporters of the old and new calendars. Once the continuation war had come to an end, and the monastery had settled in at its new site, the monks, on their own initiative, rejoined the Russian Orthodox Church without permission from the Finnish Church. The Russian Church was glad to receive them back, because there was a strong desire in Russia at that time to incorporate the whole Orthodox Church of Finland within that of Russia, of which it was formerly a diocese. The Finnish Church would not agree to this, but the 2 monasteries, New Valamo and Konovica, now evacuated to Kaitela, did join the Russian Church. This meant that they were spiritually subject to Russia, while being administratively governed by the Orthodox Church of Finland. This situation created confusion in very many ways, but it did mean that the monks would again follow the Julian calendar as they had wished. It also restored peace within their ranks and enabled them, as Father John said, to worship with one mind and one heart. The Russian ecclesiastics accompanying Metropolitan Grigori also extended some hopes of the monastery being able to return to Old Valamo, which many of them were very eager to do. Father John was not so enthusiastic. Quote, "I would not personally be particularly pleased to go back. Why should we go there merely to encounter troubles? We don't yet know on what conditions they will let us live there." Unquote. The staretz also argued that since the one large body of monks had now dwindled to a handful of old men, they simply could not manage all the work entailed in the life of a monastery of the size of Old Valamo. It was not long, in any case, before the position of the Church in the Soviet Union became more difficult, and Moscow no longer gave them to understand that there would be any hope of returning. The question was not completely buried, however, but resurfaced again in the mid-1950s in a new form. The life and status of the Church of Russia in the Soviet Union was a topic of constant discussion among the monks, prompted in part by the powerful propaganda aimed by the Russian Church in exile at that still functioning in the homeland. This synodal church, which espoused strong monarchist views, was unashamedly hostile towards the official Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union, accusing it of collaboration with the communist government. It published numerous journals and other material, and was also able to propagate its opinions through the Western media. Father John came to hear at one stage about a sermon full of bitterness towards the Patriarchate of Moscow, which had been preached in the Russian Church in exile, and mentioned it in a number of his letters and certain articles, defending the Church of Russia and calling for sympathy and not condemnation. Quote, "I have been deliberating on matters of church politics. It is outrageous that foreigners are slandering the Patriarchate of Russia. It is easy to stand in a corner and shout at other people, but just try to direct the anchor of orthodoxy in the midst of a godless people. It is indeed a heroic feat. It calls for careful consideration. One has to be constantly choosing the lesser of two evils." Unquote. 4 v. 1954. Quote, "Why shouldn't they recognize the government when they live in the country? When the Jews were in exile in a heathen land, it was laid down in the Word of God that they should pray for those in authority over them. Real orthodoxy is indeed only to be found in Russia. Patriarch Alexei maintains careful supervision over the divine services and insists that they should all be celebrated in accordance with the regulations. I know very well that other churches have more panikidas than funerals. Shame on you, you foreign bishops, when you can't see the beam in your own eye. You simply don't want to see it, but rather the mote in the eye of a suffering church." Unquote. 25 v. III, 1954. Quote, "They want to run down the Holy Russian Orthodox Church, but it is only in Russia that pure orthodoxy exists any longer. What a wealth of saintly intercessors it has in heaven, both churchmen and laymen, like Saint Sergei of Radonej, and others who found favor in the sight of God. And what of the sacred, miracle-working icons of the Queen of Heaven, which saved Russia in her direst moments? I believe that all these will even now save the Orthodox land of Russia. Do not despair." Unquote. 10 VIII, 1954. And he had further praise for the Church of Russia. Quote, "A lady from Finland who visited Russia went to a church there and saw how earnestly the people prayed. She recounted that, to her shame, she had made the sign of the cross carelessly, and the person standing next to her said, 'You are not Orthodox if you cross yourself like that.' She had felt very embarrassed." Unquote. 28 VIII, 1954. Why on earth is it that the Russians and the Greeks, representatives of the two oldest Orthodox countries, always find it difficult somehow to put up with each other? Father John does not seem to be any exception in this sense. He is a faithful son of his own country, and so ready to latch on to a story told by a like-minded friend who had visited Greece. Quote, "The Greeks are prepared to criticize religious matters in Russia over the radio. They abandon their own dead and hurry to mourn over other people's dead. Real orthodoxy is only to be found in Russia nowadays. The Greeks once possessed it, but they have let it go to ruin." A hieromonk who had been there told me that he had just shown a relic which was kept wrapped in a rag. Just imagine what callousness towards a holy object. And the altar servers kicked the side doors to the sanctuary open. He told me a lot of other unpleasant things as well." Unquote. 1 VI, 1954. The staretz would gaze in admiration at the page in the calendar of the Church of Russia which carried photographs of the bishops. His note to Yelena Axelyevna reads, quote, "I am sending you 2 calendars. Look how many bishops there are, and they all have beards." 24 III, 1953. Why shouldn't I return to my homeland? The question of the monks from New Valamo returning to Russia arose again in the 1950s, although now there was no talk of them going back to Old Valamo, but simply to their homeland. The monastery's decision to rejoin the Church of Russia had given rise to constant friction and conflict with the representatives of the Finnish Orthodox Church, who had found it difficult to reconcile themselves to the fact that the monks had taken matters into their own hands in an issue of such great importance. Many regarded them as guilty of rebellion against the official church hierarchy. These views were further compounded by the poor relations that prevailed between the 2 churches, official communion having been broken off between them at the time when the Finnish church had left the Patriarchate of Moscow and affiliated itself to Constantinople. It was not until 1957 that relations were restored, by which time the Church of Russia had created an office of bishop to serve the monasteries in Finland and the émigré parishes in Helsinki, which were also under the jurisdiction of Moscow. The holder of this office, Mikhail, Bishop of Luga, frequently visited Finland and also called at the monasteries. The situation of a bishop of a foreign church appearing as head of its monasteries aggravated the representatives of the Finnish church, however, in addition to which these were still the post-war years, when attitudes towards the former enemy were naturally cold and reserved. The monks at the monasteries, of course, afforded Bishop Mikhail a warm welcome. Quote, "The bishop celebrated the vigil, assisted by 6 hieromonks and 3 hierodeacons, and he also preached a sermon on the second coming of the Lord after the liturgy. I would say that he spoke well. After the Molibin, he presented the whole monastery with an icon from Patriarch Alexei. We read the Akathist together with the priests, of which there were 4, and the bishop, and afterwards we all went up to kiss the Patriarch's icon. We had our evening meal, the bishop and the council of the monastery, in the Igumen's residence. The conversation was about everyday matters. In fact, the bishop didn't seem to be very good at keeping up a conversation. Then, afterwards, he asked me to discuss something with him in private. I sat with him for an hour and a half, and we spoke about a number of things. He told me what a difficult position he was in and spoke about his visits to Finland and about the parishes affiliated to Moscow. He has no spiritual experience and understands little of the inner life. He touched upon the sermon that he had given. You spoke well, I said. He thanked me for our discussions. He is also going to speak with Father Mikhail. He visited him in his cell in the summer and was impressed with him. On Monday, the bishop came in halfway through the liturgy. When I came to the sanctuary to receive the holy gifts, he was standing there, and I asked him, "How did you sleep?" "Excellently," he answered. "Good," I said. Sleep is an effective medicine. The choir sang well, but my prayers were somehow tinged with sorrow. After lunch, we each received 50 grams of tea from the bishop and a pot of caviar between 2. The bishop went into the forest with some of the monks in a horse-drawn sleigh to see the logs being cut, and then walked back, saying that it is hard enough for the horse anyway with such a load to pull. He's very interested in the work that we do at the monastery. He said at one stage, "There are a lot of lies written about me in the papers, but I am writing a defense. There are some people here, too, who look down on him and don't come to church when he is officiating, saying that he is in the pay of the Bolsheviks." Unquote. The constant rise in the average age of the monks, the lack of new novices, and the deteriorating conditions at the monastery also aroused doubts in the minds of many of its inhabitants as to how long it could keep going, and these were only compounded by the continued poor relations with the Finnish church. This pessimistic atmosphere gave rise almost automatically to a feeling in the minds of many of the older monks that they should try to return to their homeland of Russia, where there had been a number of viable monasteries functioning since the war. When the main organ of the Finnish Orthodox Church, Aamun Kuitto, published a long article in 1954 dealing with canonical matters in the church, it called directly for the closure of the monasteries. The reason it gave was their illegal affiliation with the Patriarchate of Moscow, carried through without consultation with the leadership of the Finnish church. This article naturally aroused unrest among the monks and further prompted them to consider returning to Russia. Father John evidently also had such plans in mind at that stage. Quote, "By the grace of God, I am living happily enough for the time being, as you see, and my health is unchanged. There will be no more news regarding the monasteries until the meeting of the General Assembly of the Finnish Church. If they send us back to Russia, I think it will cause divisions among us. The majority would be ready to go, and I would naturally. Why shouldn't I return to my homeland?" Unquote. 17 VII 1955. Quote, "Don't send the camping stove until the General Assembly has ended. If we have to move to Russia, there will be no point in my taking it with me. Now we are waiting for the decision of the General Assembly. What will be the fate of our monasteries? The monks don't want to have anything to do with the new calendar if they can avoid it." Unquote. 20 VII 1955. "We are living now in expectation of what Moscow will say. I heard that there are a few who wouldn't go to Russia at any price. Let them do as they want. I will go if Moscow invites us." The monks here are very eager to move to Russia. Some have even packed their things. Metropolitan Nikolai said that they would be very happy to have us come to them and that the people would welcome us, but we will scarcely show up to our best advantage there. We are good only in Valamo. You know our monks very well. They are very coarse in their behavior. The world has invented politeness in place of love, but we have neither, only coarseness. Sometimes I'm quite ashamed of our shocking coarseness." Unquote. 22 VII 1955. Thus Father John gradually began to alter his tone on the subject of the move. Quote, "If they invite us to Russia, we will be going home. But we are very well off here. We have running water, electricity, central heating, and a beautiful spot to live in, just like a ski. There are some who are very anxious to return to Russia, but I doubt whether we would have the same freedom there. A nun wrote to me recently from Estonia saying that we are better off where we are now. If we go there, we will scarcely show up to advantage, as we are getting older and becoming coarser in our behavior. They are expecting something of us there, the Valamo tradition, but they will be disappointed." The practical arrangements for the return to Russia began to take shape upon the visit of Nikolai, Metropolitan of Krutitsa and Kolomna, to New Valamo. Quote, "Metropolitan Nikolai, a priest, and a secretary from the Russian embassy were here. There was a short moleben after the service, and then the Metropolitan preached a theological sermon. It ranged over many subjects, but it did not touch the heart. At 1 o'clock we gathered in the church, and he explained that the purpose of his visit was that the churches of Finland and Russia should be united, and that the monastery should transfer officially to the Gregorian calendar and come under the counsel of the Finnish Orthodox Church. A few monks began to ask him whether they could move back to Russia, and he agreed to this as an act of love and said he would take down their names. There were 24 who wanted to do this. There is no place set aside for us in Russia, though, and we would have to be split up. Somewhere in the south there seems to be 2 convents, and if all of us from Valamo were to go there, they might move the nuns from one of these to the other and move us into the empty one, but it all seems very vague. We intend to continue to hold our services according to the old calendar. Bishop Paavali sent the Igumen a really considerate letter on the 15th. I realize that there is great agitation among the brotherhood. Be at ease. Celebrate your services in the old way. There will be no pressure whatsoever on our part." Unquote. Father John had gradually reversed his opinion entirely. Quote, "I believe it would be best to stay here. We have settled in well, and this is a quiet place." Unquote. 15 VII 1957. Quote, "There is little talk for the moment of the move to Russia. We have heard nothing yet from the Patriarchate. A few of those who put their names on the list have changed their minds. There is no definitive place for them there, and they would have to be split up. It won't be easy for them. Whereas here everything is arranged very nicely. We are entirely free. We have our pensions, and there is even a shop close by. What else does one need? We are not being driven into Russia or pressurized to go. We can keep our Julian calendar, and since the Russian and Finnish churches are united into a single church, we do not have that confusion any longer. And if that church is not approved, then what church could we possibly belong to? Father Pamva became rather too excited and doesn't know himself why he wants to move. Father Symphorian, on the other hand, never intended to move in the first place. A few had their reasons for wanting to go. Dmitri wanted to return to the village where he came from. Father Sergei wanted to become a parish priest, and the others also had ideas of their own. Unquote. 25 v. 1957. The following 22 names of those who had signed the list are mentioned by Father John: Mikhail, Isaver, Lucas, Nikita, Jonah of Konovica, Guri, Makushin, Fyodor the singer, Benedict, Gamaliel, Rodion, Hieromonk Johannes from Konovica, Gennady, Varsonifi, Anatoly of Petsamo, Ivan Fedotov, Herman, Kernikov, Theopempt, Sergei, Boris, and Nun, foreman of the workers. In the end, however, there were only 7 who left for Russia: Fathers Mikhail, Isaver, Lucas, Gennady, Sergei, Guri, and Boris, all of them going to the idyllic monastery of Petzer, near Pskov. All of these former monks of Valamo have now passed on into eternity. Father John was in hospital in Hanovesi on the day when they left, and so was not able to say goodbye. He comments in a letter written to Yelena Axelyevna from hospital, quote, "It is a good thing that our fathers have been provided with proper accommodation and have their own acts of obedience to perform. Father Mikhail is to be assistant to the Father Confessor. Then people will come to visit him. I only hope this will not lead to temptation, for the Father Confessor may become jealous of him. The Lord grant them wisdom to live together in peace." Unquote. 31 XII 1957. Letters from a staretz of Valamo. Some of Father John's letters were published in Amun Koito during the 1950s, translated by its editor at the time, Hieromonk Paavali, and these opened up the teachings and the views of the staretz to a Finnish readership for the first time. Sinaida Bayakin, one of Father John's spiritual children, had read these and wrote to the staretz about them. Quote, "They are very well translated," she comments. "Someone should publish a collection of all your letters." This was an opinion shared by many of his other friends, and since the staretz himself was quite agreeable to this being done, they set about the practicalities of the task. The letters were selected and edited for publication by a group consisting of 3 of the people closest to Father John: Yelena Armfelt, Tito Colliander, and a former officer in the Tsarist army, Nikolai Dorogan. The idea of publishing the letters was first raised in autumn 1953, and work was put underway immediately to publish them in their original language, Russian. The first collection, a mimeographed version, was completed in summer 1956, the staretz being kept informed by letter about the progress of the work through its various stages. He was eager, in fact, to join in the preparatory work himself, and even traveled to Helsinki to take part in selecting the letters together with the group. Quote, "I have been thinking of visiting you all the time. I am still strong enough to do so, and provided the Father Igumen will release me for a week, I would like to look through the letters with you." Unquote. 24 I 1954. Yelena Axelyevna was enthusiastically involved in the work, and the staretz wrote to her about it on many occasions. Quote, "I enclose a letter to a priest. Read it and pass it on to Ina Colliander. She is collecting my letters. Those letters don't contain any names of other people, but the ones that went between us almost all do, as I naturally answered your letters according to the contents. You have a letter written in pencil for Ianova. Leave it out, as Ina has the same one already. Likewise, leave out the letter about the chalice. My inner sufferings are not the sort of things outsiders will understand." Unquote. 4 v. 1954. There were also setbacks at times. Some of the letters disappeared, and the staretz had to write and console his distressed friends. Quote, "It's not worth grieving over the lost letters. Apparently a lot of them had been collected together at Ina's. Except the will of the Lord. It was obviously in his designs that they should be lost. There were a lot of people at the wedding, and they could easily have gone astray then. Ina is also very sorry about it. She is going through all her things in the trunks. If you have made yourself ill over it and have had to go to bed, then get well quickly and don't fret over idle matters. There have always been setbacks, and always will be. It couldn't be otherwise." Unquote. 6 XI 1954. The process of publishing the collection of letters inspired the staretz to write additions to them, articles on matters connected with the spiritual life, and some of these letters were included in the Pisma Walamskiego Starca, letters from an staretz of Valamo, later translated into English as Christ is in our midst. Understandably, not all of these articles were successful, and not all were thought suitable for publication in the future edition. The publishers were perplexed and feared that the staretz would be offended. There was no need to worry, however. Quote, "Don't worry unnecessarily about my articles. I wrote and told you that I was sending them to you and Tito to review. If you think that they are not necessary, it doesn't worry me in the slightest, just as I don't worry over the letters that you left out. I advise you not to let these things disturb you. You say that you went as far as losing sleep over it. Keep calm. I won't write about deification because I don't know how, and because I am constantly bound up with my passions and cannot break free of them. The gospel story of the widow suits me precisely. Lord, help me to free myself from the slavery of my passions. Amen." Unquote. 28 IV, 1956. A number of the articles which Father John supplied were added to the book, however. For example, the ones on the Holy Communion, the life of prayer, dreams, and blasphemous thoughts. The staretz recounted that he became so involved in his subject when writing about the incarnation of the Son of God that he was crying as he wrote the article. Then he adds a request. Quote, "Don't leave out the article on foreign bishops. Let people read it. There's no need to be afraid. Will I live long enough to see this collection published? That I don't know." Unquote. 22 XI, 1954. Since the people responsible for the publication of the book were all on small incomes, the financial side of the venture also caused problems. Father John tried to solve these in his own way. Quote, "How many of my letters have you collected together? Dmitri Dorogon told me that they can be printed here in Finland and it won't be expensive. They could be printed in the same way as G. Svetlav's book of prayers. Inquire about it. You could also collect money in aid of it. Claudia Korolin, Tito, Schultz, and a few others more besides. This is only my idea, though. Do as you think best. I am feeling very well." Unquote. 14 XI, 1955. Father John was asked to write a foreword to the book describing himself and his thoughts, and Ivan Isayev, a crippled brother at the monastery who was confined to bed, copied it out in an elegant hand before it was sent to Helsinki. Father John asked Ina Colliander to paint a picture of a monk sitting and writing a letter for the cover of the Russian mimeographed edition, but this could not be done, presumably for technical reasons. Then he himself designed a cover with a decorative border. He was not entirely satisfied with it, however. Quote, "The cover has arrived from the printers. It has not turned out well, but it is better than nothing." His suggestion for a title was Pisma o Duchovnoi Żyni, Letters on the Spiritual Life, but the publisher proposed Pisma Walamskiego Starca, Letters from a staretz of Valamo, and he was quite satisfied with this. Sometimes the group responsible for publishing the letters was divided amongst itself on matters connected with the printing. Long discussions were held on the question of which letters to include in the collection, for instance, and which to leave out. Each stood by his own preference and attempted to justify those to Father John, who listened to them and tried to understand and reach a compromise. Eventually he withdrew completely and entrusted the planning of the book entirely to Tito Colliander. On one occasion, he reassured Yelena Axelyevna, quote, "I had a letter from Titushka in which he reported in answer to my letters that the affair is going forward gradually. He has now gone through the letters, left some out and crossed out passages that are unnecessary, etc. There is no point in rushing things," he says, pointing out that a project that has been planned properly never benefits from haste. "Let him do as he likes, and don't you start getting anxious either." Unquote. 14 II, 1956. All in all, the staretz was pleased with the publication of his letters. Quote, "I am most grateful for all the work you are doing to publish my letters. I never even imagined that this could happen one day. I wrote what was in my heart, to the glory of God. Not wisdom of my own, but quotations from the Holy Fathers, although there are some experiences of mine included as well, of course. God bless you. Continue with the work. My thanks to Zenaida, too, for her hard work. It is not easy to be continually tapping with one's fingers either." Unquote. 8 II, 1956. It sometimes occurred to the staretz, quote, "What would the theologians say of my letters?" Unquote. 3 IV, 1956. Father John also wrote an article on the Most Holy Mother of God for the book, but for some reason it was omitted. Part of this article is included here. Quote, "O Holy Mother of God, assist me who am poor in understanding, to write about the greatness of your being, for you were chosen from among all generations to carry in your womb the Creator of the universe. It is meet and right to call you the Mother of God. I, an unworthy monk, wish to recount here 3 miraculous incidents concerning the Mother of God. The well-known artist and academician Hieromonk Alippi painted a full-length icon of the Mother of God with the child Jesus in her arms. He would work on it at the same time as the akathist to the Mother of God was being read in church. They used to say to him, 'Now they are reading the akathist,' and he would begin painting, and when they said, 'The akathist is over,' he would stop. He completed the whole icon in the course of a few readings. The icon was hung on the right-hand column of the Uspensky Cathedral in Helsinki, and then later, for some reason unknown to me, it was taken to the Church of St. Nikolai, where no services were held, and placed up against the west wall along with a heap of old icons, candle holders, and other objects. The monks forgot this holy image altogether. One devout woman had a dream in which the Mother of God appeared to her and said, 'Go to Valamo and tell Igumen Panteleirnon to have my icon brought to the main church. The Igumen will not believe you at first, but tell him over and over again until he believes. Show him where the icon is, and he will take 2 monks with him and follow you. When they bring my icon in, a schema monk in a white robe will come and kiss it.' Everything happened exactly as the woman had dreamt. The book of the prophet Joel says, quote, 'The day shall come when I pour out my spirit on all mankind. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men see visions.' The icon of the Mother of God was brought to the main church and placed on a pillar on the right-hand side. When we fled from Valamo, it was brought with us and hung on the right-hand side of the church, just in front of the iconostasis. Schema monk Maletti at Valamo had an icon of the Mother of God of Kozelshansk on a shelf in one corner of his cell. Once while he was out of the cell, a novice came in looking for money. He knew that Maletti had lived in the town and thought that he would have some money. As soon as he stepped inside the cell, a flame issued from the icon and came towards the novice. He was stricken with fear and ran out of the cell in fright. He confessed his sin to everyone afterwards and told them about the miracle of the icon. I have an icon of the Mother of God holding the child Jesus in her arms, again painted by Father Alippi. I prayed in front of this icon for 20 years before sending it to a disconsolate nun at the convent of Pitiza in Estonia. She wrote to me, 'When I received the icon, I took it to my cell. A delightful scent came from it for 3 days. The other nuns came to my cell, and they smell it too.' The great ascetic Maximos Kausalevit was a firm believer in the Mother of God. One day he came into church and approached an icon of the Virgin with an indescribable sense of warmth in his heart and kissed it. At the same moment he felt a special warmth in his heart and his chest, which came from the holy icon and guided him into a state of deep devotion." Unquote. Reactions to the collection of letters. The outwardly unpretentious collection of letters of a Valamo staretz in the original Russian appeared in typewritten, mimeographed form in the summer of 1956. The staretz himself was greatly pleased with it, and sent copies to his friends both at home and abroad as greetings. Quote, "My book has arrived in Sweden and Britain. I wonder how it will be received in America. I beg you, send a copy to Georgia Shukina at the convent of Pitiza in Estonia. She will be delighted to get it. It is possible to send things there now. Father Pamba sends books too. I think it will go in the post as an ordinary parcel. See for yourself what the situation is." Unquote. 17 IX, 1956. Father John sent 3 copies to the convent of Lintula, to Sisters Seraphima, Antonia, and Yevgenia, and also one to the Russian Old People's Home in Porvu, for which the matron sent a letter of thanks. He was naturally interested in what the readers thought of his letters, and was genuinely delighted to be able to tell Yelena Axelyevna the news. Quote, "I had a long letter from Nadia Schultz, who writes that Constantine sent my book to a lawyer in Argentina who was very pleased with it, and said, "A wonderful book. There is a great deal of Christian wisdom and truth in these letters of Schema Monk John. Each incident is connected with features of everyday human life, accidents, fears, or penitence. The most striking thing in the book is the character of Father John himself." Nadia goes on to say that Constantine is pleased that he is able to read my letters in Finnish translation, as they are going to be published in Hekuva Hilos and Amun Koito. The reception at New Valamo was of quite different order, as could be foretold from one earlier incident. Quote, "I gave Father Lucas my article on the incarnation of the Son of God to read, and he returned it saying, 'There's room for improvement in your literary style.' You see how much our monks understand of theology." Quite simply, nothing is said here about my book at all. Father Tarasi said it's expensive and nothing more. The Father Igumen said, "I read it right through. I kept 2 copies for myself and gave the others to Father Symphorian, the treasurer, the bursar, and others." Unquote. 26 VIII 1956. Some months went by, and then the staretz's own confessor, Father Tarasi, was ready to pass an opinion on the book on behalf of himself and, understandably, various others who were of the same opinion. This sent Father John hurrying to share his feeling with Yelena Axelyevna. Quote, "I am writing to you at once, but I warn you in advance. Keep calm and don't be depressed. I told you earlier that Father Tarasi hasn't said anything about my collection of letters. Yesterday, after praying to God, I went to see him and took with me an article in which a professor at the Leningrad Academy reviewed my book and read it to him. Poor Father Tarasi flew into a tremendous rage and began to slate my letters. He attacked both me and you with many nasty words, which I won't start to repeat. He called those who pray babblers and said he would burn my book. I insisted that he should not burn it, but give it back to me. He looked for it but couldn't find it and said he would give it to me later. He hasn't brought it yet. He was full of praise for Father Mikhail. What is most amazing in all this is that I was not the slightest bit put out in my heart, as I felt so strongly that God was helping me. Without God's help, we sinners would not be able to survive even the smallest amount of distress. Glory be to God in his boundless mercy. Even now I feel no reproach towards him in my heart. This could not be so without God's mercy." Unquote. 28I 1957. Quote, "My confessor, Father Tarasi, hasn't given my book back yet, but I won't ask him for it. I don't think he will burn it. He's probably reading it again in order to criticize it. I'm not surprised. On Saturday, I asked for his blessing to take communion, and on Sunday he was celebrating and gave me the communion. I can't stop laughing when I remember his words, 'Those who pray are babblers.' It was a good thing that I had read him the professor's review. It was that sent him into a temper. He called the reviewer a madman, too. He doesn't understand anything. I didn't let it disturb me, though. I left quite peaceably. I suppose there was no other way in which he could have expressed his dissatisfaction with me." Unquote. 5II 1957. Quote, "Father Tarasi has now started to take a conciliatory line with me. He hasn't given me the book back, but then neither have I asked for it. He's welcome to search through it and pick out my faults. It doesn't worry me. I think he realized now that he doesn't understand the spirit or the power of the teachings of the Holy Fathers. Where most of the Valamo monks are concerned, the letter of the law kills the spirit. This book makes asceticism even more difficult for those monks who are seeking the one thing needful. I don't write this in condemnation, but it does seem that the monks' ideas on the spiritual life have become clearer to me. I usually try to keep out of all discussions without the other monks noticing, and then read the same books of the Holy Fathers on the inner life over and over again. It's rare nowadays to meet a person who is familiar with the depth of the spiritual life and understands the teaching of the Holy Fathers correctly. A monk might talk a lot about the spiritual life, but you can tell his sources straight away. Discussions about the spiritual life call for sympathy and an aspiration towards that life. There is no room for the letter here, and those who go by that letter have a quite different idea of the whole matter. Although I was a novice when I read the writings of Bishop Ignatius, I can still remember every word. He speaks of how a person who observes the rule of ascetic prayer will simply be given no peace by those who adhere to the letter. Oh, how well the wise bishop expressed it. He said it from his own spiritual experience, while the supporters of the letter of the law look upon those who pray with quite different eyes. Amen. Write and tell me what you think of Father Tarassi's intentions to burn my book. Unquote. 12 II 1957. Thinning of the ranks. Quote, we have still not reached the end of the Sorokost for Brother Simeon, and there are another 2 deceased to be buried. Hieromonk Vlasi died at 6:30 in the morning on 1st November, and Hieromonk Mikhail at 11 o'clock at night on the 2nd. They were buried together in the same grave on 4th. Father Vlasi was 68 years old, and Father Mikhail 63. There are still many more candidates for eternal life, for there are 72 monks aged between 73 and 84 years old. You see what kind of community we are. Even I am 73 and am awaiting my departure. I've a feeling that my candle of life will soon have burned down. The hieromonks I mentioned passed away peacefully and were able to receive communion before they died. May the Lord remember them in his kingdom. Unquote. 24x 1946. Quote, Father Anthony is very weak. I took him the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. I can't imagine that he will recover. There are some others that are even weaker, though. Brother Aristovel, who was the shoemaker, has gone to be with his forefathers. He had been sick for some time and went about with his mouth open and his tongue hanging out. I've just been to see Father Anthony, and it looks as if he may recover after all. He's been in bed, of course. Unquote. 25 III 1949. Quote, today, 3rd August, I held a funeral service for the 76-year-old Brother Terenti, who used to heat the sauna, and buried him in the cemetery. He died suddenly yesterday. There are still others ready to move on to the life to come. Unquote. 3 VIII 1949. Quote, Hero Deacon Anthony died at 6:40 in the evening on 20th July. He just fell asleep, as it were, wonderfully, peacefully. I had given him Holy Communion in the morning. He had been in a bad way for some time, but suffered without complaining. 16 VIII 1951. We buried 2 of our number on Friday, Igumen Gavril from Berlin and Father Ivan Kalinin, who had 1 leg. The first died at 10 o'clock in the evening and the second an hour later. We have had 5 deaths so far this year. Our ranks are thinning. I was going to the Trapeza today when I saw 2 people carrying our deputy Igumen, who had fallen and been unable to get up. They had made living quarters for him in a cell in the other building. He is still conscious at the moment, but can't get up or walk. I can't imagine him living for long. Unquote. 11 V 1952. Quote, Hieromonk Jonah from Petsamo died at 7 o'clock in the evening on 23rd. That makes 10 this year. Unquote. 24 X 1952. Quote, today we buried Brother Christopher. At the age of 82, he died peacefully sitting in his chair. Unquote. 30 I 1953. Quote, Brother Pavali is dead. The funeral will be on Tuesday. Father Roman is getting weaker, and I have taken him the sacrament of the anointing. There are other candidates, too, with their sights on eternal life. The life of the monastery is going ahead quietly, however, even though we are getting old. Unquote. 23 I 1955. Quote, why haven't you written for such a long time? You must still be weak after your illness. We have had the same sickness here too. Almost everyone went down with it, but it didn't affect me too badly. Now I am going to take communion to the sick. There are 1 or 2 old monks who are very ill. We are well prepared, however. There are a few graves dug and some coffins made. Unquote. 10 II 1955. 6 more monks have joined their ancestors. Neil, Roman, Anani, Pavali, Yevsevi, and Diomid, and also Maria, the seamstress. She had to grieve and shed many a tear, poor thing, but she passed away peacefully. I gave her communion a day beforehand, and she wanted it again, but when I went to hear her confession, she was already dying. She said to Natalia, but they beat me right up to the end. Then she just fell asleep. Unquote. 17 III 1955. Father Ruffin wanted to wallpaper his cell just 3 days before he died. but he prepared himself well for the end. He gave me money for bread and said, quote, "When they toll the bell for my death, give Father Julian 400 marks. Write and tell my nephew that I am dead. May the Lord bring him to his kingdom." Unquote. 17 III 1955. Father Valerian died peacefully at 11 o'clock at night. The funeral will be on Wednesday. I gave him communion the previous day. He was very fat when he was still in good health. You must remember him, but he lost so much weight when he fell ill that he was little more than a skeleton at the very end. It is 10 o'clock at night. I'll take this letter to the box in the morning. Unquote. 14 XI 1955. Quote, "Schema monk Ilarion, the bell ringer, has been suffering terribly. He would cry out in pain in the night. Now he is a little better, and he had some soup and bread to eat. He's the same age as I am." Unquote. 24 XI 1955. Quote, "Today at 12 noon there was a funeral service for 2 monks, Gervasi and Evtikin. The first was 83 years old and the latter 81. I visited Father Evagri. His hands and feet were swollen, and he had difficulty in breathing. I realized that the end was near, that he was ready to move on to the world of eternity. He said to me, 'Now I will follow the instructions of Saint Seraphim of Sarov and recite the Jesus prayer before lunch and the prayer of the Mother of God after lunch. He is in good spirits.'" Unquote. 13/12/1956. Quote, "Father Evagri died peacefully, one could say blissfully. He was conscious the whole time and very peaceful. I gave him communion in the morning and he died at 10 o'clock. The little he had in the way of money and goods he divided among the brethren. I went to visit him and he thanked me for it. He was no trouble to anyone during his illness. May the Lord bring him to his kingdom." Unquote. 20 I 1957. At the cemetery. Quote, "Today I went to the cemetery. It was beautiful weather and the road was dry. I went round all the graves and read the inscriptions on them. Who died, when, how many years each spent in the monastery, and how old each was when he died. There are now 154 monks resting in the cemetery of New Valamo. I knew them all. Now their bodies lie in these graves, as the law of death is an inexorable one. We know where and when we were born, but where and when we will die, that is not for us to know. Man is taken from the earth, and to the earth he must return. But his spirit is of God, and will return to be with God. Where are you now, noble fathers? What kind of life are you leading? I firmly believe that you are not dead. You have merely moved on to another unseen world. But the deceased remain deaf to my words. Where they are, and what life they are living, is a great mystery. The holy Apostle Paul speaks of how we walk by faith and not by sight. Our brotherhood has declined completely into old age. Most of us walk with a stick. There are a few graves dug ready and a few coffins in store. Soon, very soon, my earthly body will be laid in one of those coffins, lowered into a cold tomb and covered with sand. They will make a little mound on top of the grave and set up a cross there. Perhaps there will be some good person who will write my name on a plate and fix it to the cross. Noble fathers who remain, I beseech you, when you come to my grave, pray for my sinful soul. My thoughts, 1956, Schema Igumen John. The candle burns down. Quote, "I have also been sick on and off. My heart palpitations continue, but I have become used to them and don't pay any attention to them anymore. I am not taking any medications, as my candle is burning down." Unquote. Father John first mentioned physical pains of the kind brought on by old age in a letter to Martha Platonov in July 1950. These then increased from year to year and weakened his constitution. He still took practically a full part in the work and activities of the monastery, however, as he had also been basically strong and was able to resist this weakening of his bodily powers. With time, the regular celebration of the services began to be too much for him, and he had to withdraw from the weekly rota of celebrants. But he still attended all the services and received the Holy Communion at the liturgy in the nave as a schema monk. Quote, "I didn't have a schema monk's habit and had to ask the seamstress Maria for one. She had kept that belonging to Father Jeremy, which was very beautifully made. I decided it would be easier to receive communion on the steps in the habit of a schema monk, than be in the way of the celebrants in the sanctuary. That's a better and quieter way of doing it, I think." Unquote. 7 IV 1954. Father John celebrated his last cycle of regular services on returning from hospital at the end of 1954. Quote, "By the grace of God, I am feeling well for the moment. You know, of course, that I was discharged from the hospital. I had 11 days rest there, and it helped a lot. I celebrated the whole daily cycle of services on my third day back at the monastery. Vespers, Akathist, and Pravilo in the evening, and Matins and the liturgy the next morning. They were my farewell services, as it were. I no longer have the strength. Even this cycle was hard for me. I have begun to have difficulty with breathing, and am feeling weak, which is only to be expected at my age. I don't know how long I will continue my earthly pilgrimage. The body is raised from the earth, and to the earth it must return. But the soul is of God, and will return to God. A man does not die, but passes on to another life. I have now begun to feel this personally." Unquote. 6 XII 1954. The round of correspondence also gradually subsided, as he did not have the strength to keep it up. Quote, "My strength is gone. I can't manage to write letters any more. I'm late with my replies. A nursing sister from Sweden has written to the Father Igumen asking how I am." Unquote. 24 I 1956. Quote, "I have collected together my notes and will send them to you. Read them through and destroy them as you see fit. I don't want them to be left in my cell after I am gone. Although I am feeling quite well in myself at the moment, it is natural that my life should be virtually at an end, and the time near for me to move on to another eternal and unending life." Unquote. 13 IV 1957. The mirror also told the truth. Quote, "I looked at myself in the mirror, a dead man if ever there was one. My eyes and cheeks are sunken in, but the wonderful thing is that my spirit is still strong and vigorous." Unquote. 24 I 1957. Father John began to need regular help during his last few months, and within the monastery this service was provided by Hierodeacon Jonah, the shoemaker, and Father Dmitri from Karolina. His spiritual children also took turns to come and look after him. Although the monks did not approve of women coming to wash and care for a schema monk, it was obvious that he badly needed nursing of this kind. Apart from all the usual ailments of old age, he was suffering from an untreated hernia, which caused him great pain at times. Then Father Jonah and Father Dmitri began to tire of nursing him. Quote, "Father Jonah told me today that they had other things waiting to be done. Dmitri hasn't said anything to me, but Father Jonah said that it is difficult to get on with him. I am beginning to develop dropsy. What will become of me? I don't know. I beg for your prayers." Unquote. 30 IX 1957. This tiredness soon went over, however, for in answer to Yelena Axelyevna's nervous letter to him, Father Jonah sent a soothing note written in a beautiful hand. Quote, "God-fearing Yelena Axelyevna, be at ease regarding Father John. He is satisfied with the way we are looking after him, and we have no particular difficulties with him at the moment. It is better for him to be at home here than in the hospital, and that is why we are not sending him to Heinevesi or to you. Now he is able to get up again and to change his bandages himself. We dry them on the radiator in his cell, as it is not worth taking them to the bakery to get dry. There are 2 of us, and if he gets any worse, we can take turns to look after him. At the moment there is little to do, and it is mainly a matter of keeping an eye on the progress of his illness. We will write to you if any medicines are needed. I am at home here all the time, and if my help is needed I am always ready. We thank you for the love and goodness you continue to show for the staretz. Hierodeacon Jonah, 23rd October 1957. In the November of the year prior to his death, Father John was taken to the old people's home in Heinevesi, where he rested until the middle of January. Yelena Axelyevna and some of his other spiritual children came to see him there. The old people's home was fairly near the station, and it was able to arrange overnight accommodations for those coming from greater distances away. These visits from his dear friends encouraged and consoled him greatly, especially as he was almost cut off from the other inhabitants because he spoke no Finnish. The reality of the approaching end of his life dawned on him all the more poignantly in the solitude of the old people's home than it had at the monastery. Quote, "As I face the prospect of eternal life, my mind is seized with horror. It is a great mystery, and my feelings now are quite different. John Climacus says in his Ladder, men should not accuse us, brothers, at the moment that our soul is to depart, of not having performed miracles, not having practiced divinity, or not having seen visions, but we will undoubtedly have to answer before God for the fact that we have not bewailed our sins. All this becomes so much clearer when a person is alone. When one is with others and involved in earthly things, the feeling is quite different." Unquote. 17 XI 1957. There was one unusual incident that happened at the old people's home, which Father John recounted in detail to Yelena Axelyevna. Quote, "A man arrived at the home, short in stature, intelligent looking, and well dressed, and asked for me. I didn't know him at all. I asked him into my room, and he began to speak to me in Finnish. He didn't speak any Russian, and I don't understand any Finnish. Why did he come, and what did he want? The sister came to change my bandages, and the visitor began to help her. He gave me some long woolen underwear and some long socks. The staff were very friendly to him, and he was given a room. But he came back to me and began to speak. I got tired of him. He followed me everywhere and talked all the time. I didn't understand a word. What on earth had gotten into his head? The staff then became worried and began to treat him as a spy, and to think that I was in league with him. I saw them talking among themselves and looking at me suspiciously. Just at the right moment, Claudia's parcel arrived, and as they didn't trust me sufficiently to let me open it on my own, the sister came and opened it in front of me and looked what was in it. I think they believed the parcel was intended for that man. They were wrong, though, but as I don't know the language and there was no one to interpret for me, I couldn't say anything. Then the man was sent back to Helsinki. I took it all quite calmly. He was strange, though, and was prepared to give me anything. He even took off his pullover and gave it to me. I couldn't refuse, so I took it. I must tell you this, too. The room next to mine is empty, and the old people have taken to meeting in it. They are all as wrinkled as can be. They were once as fresh as the flowers of spring, of course, but now they have more the appearance of baked potatoes. I sit in there quite often. I have so much time on my hands, and I have to do something to cheer myself up. They bring tea to our rooms at 7 o'clock in the morning. Lunch is at 10 o'clock, and at 1 o'clock we have a cup of tea and a piece of bun loaf. The evening meal is at 4 o'clock. Everyone is waiting for these moments which invigorate the body. Each, of course, has his own inner feelings, which belong to his own life. We all hope that life will go on, like the rich man in the gospel whose corn is growing well, but who has death standing behind his back. Perhaps it will be standing behind my back the next night, because its law is inexorable." Unquote. Around the middle of January, Father John was at last able to return to New Valamo, which he had missed so much. Quote, "I will write to you again from the monastery. God is merciful to me in my weakness. All my wounds have healed, and I don't need any bandages any longer, so I don't need to be looked after. What lies ahead remains in the hands of God." Unquote. What was ahead was only preparation for bringing this life to a close. Quote, "It is usually easy for us to watch someone dying, but when one has to die oneself, oh, how difficult it is to endure the horror of facing eternity. It is utterly terrifying, because we have no knowledge of what lies beyond. I go to church, but I sit down, of course." Unquote. 12I 1958. Quote, "However you try to spare your own strength, you still can't evade the law of death. You can't live twice. People differ in the way they die. For some it is difficult, for others easy, depending on what the Lord grants to each of us." Unquote. 5II 1958. Quote, "They take food from the trapeza to the monastery's infirmary, and they would bring it to me too, but mostly I go to fetch it myself. It's not too far. Yevdokia, a Karelian washerwoman who cleans the floors, helps me with everything I need. I am writing this at 3 o'clock in the morning because I can't go to sleep. I slept during the day, of course. Old people usually need very little sleep." Unquote. 11II 1958. I received your letter. Your sufferings are quite familiar to me, as I have had similar afflictions, perhaps still worse. It's easier during the day, but the nights are very long and painful. It is good that our service begins at 4 in the morning, for prayers together unburdens the mind and comforts one. These afflictions are known as major depression. It is a really dangerous state because a person can lose his grip so that he no longer knows what he is doing. Then everything gets out of hand. A conversation with a person of like mind would be good for one at such a moment, but unfortunately in these times there is no such person to be found." Unquote. 9 III 1958. The last letter that the staretz wrote is a short one, dated 16 III 1958. Quote, "I am becoming weaker all the time, and I have grown so thin, I could scarcely get into a sauna. I am sending some prosphora, one for you and one for Paula and Lydia. My greetings to the old lady Sergeyevna. I pray for God's blessing upon you. Schema Igumen John." Death. It was the obedience of the novice, Andrei Peshkov, to go to the post office in the nearby village each day, and to buy anything that the monastery needed at the shop next door to it. Often the monks also asked him to buy little things for them. On the morning of June 6th, Andrei called on the monks, as was his custom before setting out for the post office, to see if there was anything they wanted. When he came to the door of Father John's cell, he recited a prayer and went inside. Father John was bent over in a sitting position in bed. Quote, "Do you want anything from the shop today, Father John?" Unquote, Andrei asked. There was no answer, no reaction at all. Andrei went closer and repeated his question. Still no answer. Then he began to wonder and feel afraid. Andrei went to Father Gabriel in the next cell and asked him to come and look at Father John. He came and took hold of the staretz's hand. "Cold already," he said. So, in this uneventful way, Father John's body was found in his cell, already cold. The staretz had rendered up his soul to God and was awaiting the last rites from his fellow ascetics. This meant dressing him in the habit of a schema monk and placing the body in a coffin. The funeral was fixed for a couple of days later. None of these details differed in any way from the familiar routine by which the monks of Valamo had been taken on their last journeys over the years. The only difference was that there were outsiders present. Father John's closest friends, Yelena Armfelt, Claudia Korolin, Tito Colliander, and a few others. The earthly strivings of Father John, the staretz of Valamo, had come to an end. Quote, "The dust returns to the earth as it began, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 7. If the grain of wheat does not die. When we look back on the life of Father John, perhaps the text that most easily comes to mind consists of the words of our Savior in the Holy Gospel according to St. John. Quote, "In truth I tell you, a grain of wheat remains a solitary grain unless it falls into the ground and dies. But if it dies, it bears a rich harvest." Unquote. John 12:24. This parable fits the life and death of Father John perfectly when one looks at all the fruit of the Spirit which he had left behind. Only a few years had passed since his death before the Pisma Valamskago Starca, available previously to only a narrow Russian-speaking public in Finland, was translated into Finnish and published in book form. Since then, his name has become known to an ever-increasing circle of readers. There are very many who can bless the name of the staretz of Valamo in grateful thanks. Thus, Father John is not dead, but lives and imparts strength to the hearts of growing number of readers. Time passes, people come and go, and the world changes. This is certainly true as far as our external lives are concerned, but our inner lives remain unchanged. The inner man remains the same for all time. He has the same yearning for God in his heart, a spiritual thirst that leads him to seek the company of a friend of like mind, a comforter and a bringer of forgiveness. It is extremely difficult to find such a person, someone who, without condemning us, can speak to us with love and understanding of the kingdom of God. People today still long for someone like this to bring them forgiveness and guidance, and in this way it is easy to understand how more and more people find peace and consolation in the letters of Father John.